On a scorching afternoon in November 1532, a man who could neither read nor write stood at the edge of an empty plaza in the Peruvian highlands, watching the most powerful emperor in the Americas walk directly into his trap. Francisco Pizarro, bastard son of a pig farmer, commanded just 168 Spanish soldiers. Across the valley, 80,000 Inca warriors waited in perfect formation, their bronze spear points glinting like stars in the thin mountain air. What happened next would destroy the largest empire the New World had ever known and drench the ancient stones of Cajamarca in blood. The story I'm about to tell you comes primarily from the eyewitness accounts of Pedro Pizarro, Francisco's young cousin, who served as his page throughout the conquest, and from the chronicles of Francisco Lopez de Ceres, the expedition's secretary who recorded events as they unfolded. These men stood beside Pizarro during the massacre at Cajamarca, watched Atahualpa die, and witnessed the systematic destruction of a civilization. Their words, preserved in Spanish archives for nearly 5 centuries, allow us to step into that blood-soaked plaza and experience the conquest through the eyes of those who lived it. But we begin this tale not in Peru, but in the dust and poverty of Extremadura, Spain, where Francisco Pizarro learned the first and most important lesson of his life, that the world belonged to those brutal enough to take it. The year was 1478, and in the hard-scrabble town of Trujillo, a serving woman named Francisca Gonzalez gave birth to a son she could not afford to raise. The father was Captain Gonzalo Pizarro, an infantry colonel of minor nobility who acknowledged the boy but provided nothing for his upbringing. Francisco grew up in grinding poverty, sleeping in his mother's kitchen, eating scraps, wearing clothes that hung in tatters from his growing frame. While the children of proper families learned their letters and studied Latin, Francisco tended pigs in the rocky hills outside town, his only companions the grunting swine that rooted through the sparse vegetation. Trujillo was a town that bred conquistadors. The very stones seemed to whisper of distant lands where gold grew like wheat, and a man's birth mattered less than his sword arm. Hernán Cortés had been born here just a few years before Francisco. The older boy spoke in hushed tones of the Indies, of Spanish ships disappearing beyond the western horizon and returning, if they returned at all, laden with treasure that could transform a peasant into a lord. Francisco learned to fight in the streets and alleys of Trujillo, where the bastard sons of minor nobles battled for scraps of respect. He was tall for his time, perhaps 5 feet 8 inches, with the broad shoulders of a man accustomed to physical labor and the quick reflexes of someone who had survived too many fights. His face was dark from years under the Spanish sun, marked by a scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a childhood brawl he never spoke about. When he walked, there was a predatory quality to his movement, the measured pace of a man always ready for violence. By his 20th year, Francisco had absorbed the fundamental truth that would drive him across an ocean and into the pages of history. In this world, you either took what you wanted or others took it from you. He had watched his legitimate half-brothers, Hernando, Juan, and Gonzalo, inherit their father's name and property while he inherited nothing but the knowledge that noble blood meant nothing if you lacked the power to claim its privileges. The wound of illegitimacy festered in him, a constant reminder that he was forever outside the world he wished to enter. In 1509, at the age of 31, Francisco Pizarro stepped aboard a Spanish ship bound for the New World. He carried no possessions beyond the clothes on his back and a sword at his side. Behind him lay 30 years of humiliation and poverty. Ahead lay the unknown waters of the Atlantic, where fortune or death awaited with equal probability. The expedition was commanded by Alonso de Ojeda, a veteran of Columbus's voyages who had secured permission to establish a colony on the mainland coast of South America. Ojeda was a small, fierce man with grand ambitions and poor judgment, precisely the sort of leader who attracted desperate men like Francisco Pizarro. Their destination was Urabá, in what is now Colombia, where Spanish maps showed promising rivers and native settlements ripe for conquest. The crossing took 6 weeks through waters that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. Francisco had never seen the ocean before boarding the ship, and the first days at sea left him retching over the rail while more experienced sailors laughed at his misery. But he adapted, as he always had. By the time the expedition sighted the South American coast, he had learned to read the subtle language of wind and wave, to sleep in a hammock while the ship rolled beneath him, and to eat the maggoty biscuit and rancid meat that sustained Spanish expeditions. The coast of Urubá appeared through the morning mist like a green wall rising directly from the sea. Dense jungle stretched to the horizon, broken only by the brown mouths of rivers that carried unknown waters from uncharted lands. The air was thick with humidity and the calls of strange birds. As their ships anchored in the bay, Francisco could smell the rich earthiness of tropical vegetation mixed with something else, a sweetness that might have been rotting fruit or rotting flesh. The Spanish established their colony at San Sebastian, hacking a precarious foothold from the jungle. Within weeks, the settlement had become a charnel house. The heat was unlike anything the Spanish had experienced, a crushing weight that sapped strength and will. Their European clothes rotted on their bodies, their food spoiled before it could be eaten. Fresh water was scarce, and what they found often brought dysentery that left men weak and dehydrated. Worse than the climate were the Sinew people, whose lands the Spanish had invaded. These were not the simple natives Spanish explorers had encountered in the Caribbean islands. The Sinew were accomplished warriors who had spent generations defending their territory against aggressive neighbors. They used poisoned arrows that could kill a man in minutes, turning even minor wounds into death sentences. They attacked the Spanish settlement repeatedly, emerging from the jungle without warning, loosing their deadly arrows, and vanishing back into the green darkness before the Spanish could respond. Pedro Pizarro, who would later join his cousin Francisco in Peru, described the situation at San Sebastian in vivid terms. The men died so quickly that we could not dig graves fast enough. The dead lay in the streets, swelling in the heat, while the living grew too weak to move them. The natives came at night like ghosts, and in the morning we would find our sentries dead with tiny arrows in their necks, their faces black with poison. Within 6 months, 200 of the 300 colonists had died. The survivors huddled in their rotting stockade, waiting for death or rescue. When Ojeda sailed away to seek supplies and reinforcements, he left Francisco Pizarro in command of what remained. It was the first time in his life that Francisco held real authority, and he discovered he had a talent for keeping desperate men alive through sheer force of will. For weeks, Francisco held the colony together through brutal discipline and careful rationing of their dwindling supplies. He organized the strongest men into hunting parties that brought back whatever game they could find. He forced the sick to work, knowing that idle men were dead men. When native attacks intensified, he ordered the construction of better fortifications and instituted harsh punishments for sentries who slept at their posts. Some men called him a tyrant, but none could argue with results. Under his leadership, the rate of death slowed, but even Francisco Pizarro could not fight climate and disease indefinitely. When Martín Fernández de Enciso arrived with relief supplies, he found barely 70 Spanish survivors, more skeleton than man. Francisco had kept them alive, but San Sebastian was finished. Enciso ordered the colony abandoned, and the survivors sailed westward along the coast seeking a more hospitable location for Spanish settlement. It was during this coastal voyage that Francisco first heard the name that would change his life, Vasco Núñez de Balboa. The older conquistador had established himself on the western side of the Isthmus of Panama, where he ruled a small but prosperous colony called Darien. Balboa had achieved something remarkable, a stable Spanish settlement that actually fed itself and maintained peaceful relations with some native groups. More tantalizing still, Balboa claimed to have heard rumors of a vast sea beyond the mountains and a great kingdom to the south where gold was as common as iron in Spain. When Francisco met Balboa, he found a man unlike any conquistador he had encountered. Where Ojeda had been reckless and brutal, Balboa was calculating and pragmatic. He had learned native languages, married the daughter of a local chief, and built his power through a combination of diplomacy and selective violence. Most importantly, Balboa possessed the quality Francisco had been seeking all his life: the ability to transform dreams into reality. In September 1513, Balboa assembled an expedition to cross the Isthmus of Panama and reach the mysterious sea his native informants described. Francisco Pizarro volunteered immediately, drawn by the promise of discovery and the chance to serve under a leader who seemed to understand how to succeed in the New World. The crossing would take them through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth: steep mountains covered in jungle so dense that sunlight barely penetrated to the ground. The expedition numbered 190 Spanish soldiers and nearly 1,000 native porters and guides. They carried supplies for weeks, knowing they would find nothing edible in the jungle except what they killed or foraged. Francisco marched near the front of the column, his sword always ready, his eyes scanning the green walls that pressed in from both sides. The jungle was alive with sounds, the screams of unseen birds, the crash of branches as hidden animals fled their approach. And underneath it all, a constant rustling that might have been wind or might have been something else. For 25 days they climbed through green hell. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and were left behind. Others fell victim to tropical diseases that struck without warning. The native guides assured Balboa that they were close, but close could mean anything in a world where 3 miles might take 2 days to traverse. Francisco began to wonder if this expedition, like so many others, would end in death and failure. Then on the morning of September 25th, 1513, the jungle opened before them like a great door swinging wide. Francisco stood beside Balboa on a mountain ridge and looked out across the greatest expanse of water any European had ever seen from the Pacific shores of the Americas. The sea stretched to the horizon in all directions, its surface broken by islands that seemed to float like emeralds in blue crystal. A warm wind carried the salt smell of endless water and the promise of undiscovered lands. Balboa raised his sword toward the sky and claimed the sea for Spain, naming it the South Sea. Francisco watched this ceremony and felt something shift inside him. He had participated in the discovery of an ocean. He had stood at the edge of the known world and looked into the unknown. More importantly, he had learned that the impossible was merely difficult, that with enough determination a man could literally walk to the end of the earth. The discovery of the Pacific transformed Balboa into the most important Spanish leader in the New World outside of Hispaniola. Reports of his achievement reached the Spanish court, where King Ferdinand saw the potential for new conquests and new treasures. But success in the Spanish colonial system was always dangerous, and Balboa's growing power attracted the attention of rivals who feared his independence. Pedro Arias Davila, known as Pedrarias, arrived in Panama as the new royal governor in 1514. He was an old man, over 70, but possessed of a cunning and ruthlessness that made him dangerous despite his age. Pedrarias saw Balboa as a threat to his authority and began systematically undermining the discoverer of the Pacific, spreading rumors of disloyalty and rebellion. Francisco found himself caught between two powerful men who increasingly viewed each other as enemies. His loyalty belonged to Balboa, who had given him his first taste of real achievement. But Pedrarias held royal authority and commanded superior forces. When the crisis came, Francisco faced the choice that would define his character forever. In 1519, Pedrarias decided to eliminate Balboa once and for all. He sent orders for Balboa's arrest on charges of treason, and he chose Francisco Pizarro to carry out the task. The message was clear: betray your commander and friend or share his fate. Francisco read the orders and felt the familiar weight of necessity settling on his shoulders. He had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. Francisco rode out to meet Balboa, who was preparing another expedition to explore the South Sea. They met on the road outside Acla, and Francisco could see the trust in Balboa's eyes as his former lieutenant approached. That trust made what followed no easier, but no less necessary. Francisco presented the arrest warrant and watched the realization dawn on Balboa's face. The older man did not resist. He simply looked at Francisco for a long moment, then held out his hands for the shackles. Balboa was tried for treason in a proceeding that everyone understood to be a formality. The charges were absurd. Balboa had served Spain faithfully and discovered an ocean in her name, but Pedrarias needed him dead, and Spanish colonial law provided the mechanism. Francisco testified at the trial, confirming details that helped secure the conviction. He told himself he was protecting the other men who had served under Balboa, but he knew the truth. He was protecting himself. Vasco Núñez de Balboa was beheaded in the public square of Acla in January 1519. Francisco watched the execution and learned another lesson that would serve him well in Peru: that gratitude and loyalty were pleasant luxuries, but survival required harder virtues. Pedrarias rewarded Francisco's betrayal with appointment as mayor of Panama City, the most important position in the colony after the governorship itself. For the next 4 years, Francisco served as mayor and magistrate, accumulating wealth and political connections while learning the delicate art of colonial administration. He proved surprisingly effective in the role, applying the same methodical approach that had kept men alive in San Sebastian. He settled disputes between Spanish colonists, organized native labor for construction projects, and managed the complex logistics of supplying Spanish expeditions to other parts of Central America. But administration could not satisfy the hunger that had driven Francisco across an ocean. Every day, ships arrived in Panama carrying reports of new discoveries and new conquests. Hernán Cortés, his childhood neighbor from Trujillo, had landed in Mexico and sent back incredible tales of a great empire ruled by an emperor who lived in a floating city of gold. The Spanish crown was offering patents for exploration and conquest to anyone bold enough to seek them. Late at night, in his house overlooking Panama Bay, Francisco would study the crude maps that showed the South Sea stretching southward into unknown territory. Balboa's native informants had spoken of a great kingdom in that direction, ruled by a king whose people worked gold like European smiths worked iron. The stories seemed too fantastic to believe, but Francisco had learned that the New World specialized in making fantasies real. In 1524, at the age of 46, Francisco made the decision that would elevate him from colonial administrator to historical legend. He formed a partnership with 2 other Spanish residents of Panama, Diego de Almagro, a soldier and adventurer roughly his own age, and Hernando de Luque, a priest and businessman who would provide financial backing for their venture. They called their partnership the Empresa del Levante and the Enterprise of the East, though their goal lay to the south. The citizens of Panama had watched too many expeditions sail away into the unknown, never to return. They dubbed Francisco and his partners the Company of Lunatics, men so desperate for glory that they would throw away their lives chasing native fairy tales. Francisco heard the whispers and ignored them. He had been listening to other people's opinions of his chances all his life. Now, finally, he was in a position to prove them all wrong. The 3 partners divided responsibilities according to their strengths. Francisco would command the expedition and make the critical decisions. Almagro would handle logistics and recruitment using his extensive network of contacts throughout the Spanish colonies. Luque would manage finances and maintain relationships with colonial authorities who could provide official sanction for their enterprise. They began planning in secret, knowing that Pedrarias would probably forbid the expedition if he learned of it too early. The governor was old and cautious, more interested in maintaining his comfortable position than in risking resources on speculative adventures. Francisco and his partners would need to present him with a fait accompli, ships loaded, men recruited, supplies gathered, before seeking official permission. Recruitment proved easier than expected. Spanish Panama was full of men like Francisco himself, poor adventurers who had come to the New World seeking fortune and found only hard work and modest rewards. The colony offered security and a decent living for those willing to work, but it did not offer the sudden wealth that had drawn most of them across the Atlantic. When word spread quietly through the taverns and boarding houses that Pizarro was organizing an expedition to seek the Golden Kingdom, volunteers appeared daily at his door. By early 1524, Francisco had assembled a force of 80 men and 4 horses. The soldiers were mostly veterans of other expeditions, men who understood the risks but had decided the potential rewards justified them. Many were from Extremadura, hard men from hard country who shared Francisco's background and his determination to rise above their origins. They looked at their commander and saw not just another Spanish gentleman playing at conquest, but one of their own, a man who knew what it meant to be hungry and desperate. The ships were another matter entirely. Francisco purchased 2 small vessels with Luque's money, but they were old and in poor condition, the sort of ships that prudent captains avoided and desperate men accepted as their only option. The larger vessel could carry perhaps 50 men with supplies for several weeks. The smaller was barely seaworthy, suitable only for coastal voyaging in fair weather. Francisco looked at his tiny fleet and remembered Columbus setting out to find the Indies with 3 ships not much larger. It would have to be enough. In November 1524, Francisco Pizarro's first expedition to Peru departed Panama City before dawn, slipping out of the harbor while most of the colony still slept. Francisco stood at the bow of the leased ship and watched the familiar coastline fall away behind them. Ahead lay 1,500 miles of unmapped ocean and whatever waited beyond. He was 46 years old, illiterate, and commanding 2 leaking ships full of men as desperate as himself. The smart money said they would all be dead within 6 months. The smart money had never met Francisco Pizarro. The first voyage to Peru began with the kind of omen that would have sent wiser men scurrying back to port. Just 3 days out of Panama, the smaller of Francisco's 2 ships began taking on water at an alarming rate. The vessel's ancient timbers, weakened by years of tropical heat and shipworm, had opened gaps wide enough to thrust a man's fist through. By the 4th morning, the crew was bailing continuously just to keep the ship afloat, and Francisco faced his first command decision of the expedition. Pedro Pizarro, writing years later, described the scene with characteristic bluntness. The ship was dying beneath us like a wounded animal. Every wave that struck her sides drove more water through her rotten planks. The men looked to my cousin Francisco with the expression of drowning rats, waiting to see if he would turn back to Panama or press on towards certain death. Francisco chose to press on. He transferred the crew of the dying ship to his own vessel, cramming 80 men into a space meant for 50. The abandoned ship was left to sink in water so deep that no man would ever see her again. Now Francisco's entire expedition depended on a single vessel barely large enough for a coastal trading voyage, sailing into waters no European had ever mapped. The Pacific coast of Colombia and Ecuador proved to be a landscape designed by a malevolent god specifically to torture Spanish explorers. The shoreline was an endless succession of mangrove swamps, impenetrable jungle, and river mouths that promised fresh water but delivered only brackish disappointment. The equatorial sun beat down with an intensity that turned their ship's deck into a furnace, while tropical rainstorms struck without warning, soaking everything aboard and filling the air with a humidity so thick it seemed almost solid. For weeks, they sailed south along this hostile coast, searching for signs of the great kingdom their native informants had described. What they found instead were small fishing villages whose inhabitants fled at the first sight of Spanish sails. When Francisco's men managed to go ashore, they discovered settlements of perhaps 20 or 30 houses, built from wood and thatch, containing nothing more valuable than nets, pottery, and the basic tools of subsistence living. The crew began to grumble. These were not the golden cities they had been promised, but the same sort of primitive communities they could find anywhere along the Central American coast. The men who had volunteered for this expedition were veterans who understood the difference between temporary hardship and feudal suffering. After 2 months at sea, eating rotten food and drinking water that tasted of barrel rot, some began to suggest that they had been deceived by native lies and their own wishful thinking. Francisco listened to these complaints with the patience of a man who had spent his entire life hearing other people explain why his plans were impossible. He had expected this moment of crisis. Every expedition faced it. usually at the point where initial enthusiasm collided with harsh reality. The weak commanders lost their men to mutiny or despair. The strong commanders found ways to push past the moment and continue toward their goals. At a place the Spanish called Puerto del Hambre, the port of hunger, Francisco made a decision that revealed the iron core beneath his pragmatic exterior. When a delegation of his most senior soldiers approached him with a formal request to abandon the expedition and return to Panama, Francisco listened to their arguments with apparent sympathy. Then he drew his sword, thrust it point first into the sand, and spoke words that Pedro Pizarro recorded with obvious admiration. "Gentlemen, there lies Peru with its riches. Here Panama and its poverty. Choose, each man, what best becomes a brave Castilian. For my part, I go to the south." He turned and walked down the beach toward their landing boats, leaving his sword standing in the sand. One by one, his men followed him. Not because they believed in success, but because they believed in Francisco Pizarro. The expedition continued south, but the coast remained stubbornly primitive. Day after day, Francisco's ship crawled along a shoreline that seemed to mock their hopes, with its endless succession of identical fishing villages and impenetrable jungle. The men grew thinner and more desperate. Their water supplies dwindled to a few inches in the bottom of wooden casks. The hardtack had been consumed weeks earlier, leaving them dependent on whatever fish they could catch and whatever fruit they could find during brief shore excursions. Then, sometime in early 1525, they reached a river mouth where everything changed. The Rio San Juan carried more than fresh water down from the Ecuadorian highlands. It carried rumors, stories, and most importantly, evidence of a civilization unlike anything they had encountered along the northern coast. The native people they met here spoke of great cities in the interior, of a powerful king who commanded armies beyond counting, and most tantalizingly of temples whose walls were covered in sheets of gold. Francisco ordered his ship up the river, following its brown current inland through jungle so dense it formed a green tunnel overhead. The air was thick with insects and the calls of invisible birds, while strange shapes moved through the water alongside their vessel. Caimans, perhaps, or something else entirely. After several days of river travel, they reached a settlement that justified the risks they had taken to find it. The town, if it could be called that, contained perhaps 500 houses arranged around a central plaza, in a pattern that spoke of deliberate planning rather than random growth. The buildings were constructed from stone and adobe rather than wood and thatch, with tiled roofs that suggested sophisticated ceramic techniques. Most remarkably, the inhabitants did not flee at the Spanish approach. Instead, they gathered along the riverbank to watch these strange visitors with expressions of curiosity rather than terror. Francisco and a small party went ashore, their hands never far from their sword hilts, but their manner carefully peaceful. What followed was the expedition's first encounter with subjects of the Inca Empire, though neither side fully understood the significance of the meeting. The local chief, a man of obvious authority who wore clothing decorated with gold thread, greeted the Spanish with formal courtesy and offered them food and shelter. Through a combination of gestures and the few words of local language that Francisco's interpreter had learned, they began to communicate. The chief spoke of a great king who ruled from a city of stone high in the mountains, a monarch so powerful that his authority extended from the great desert in the south to the jungle in the north. This king, the chief explained, commanded armies so vast they could darken the earth like a moving forest, and his palaces contained more gold than there were leaves on all the trees. For Francisco, this conversation was a moment of pure vindication. Everything his native informants in Panama had told him was true. Somewhere beyond the coastal jungles lay an empire that dwarfed anything the Spanish had encountered in the New World. The gold ornaments worn by this minor chief, the sophisticated architecture of the town, the obvious prosperity of its inhabitants, all of it pointed toward a civilization wealthy enough to make the conquest of Mexico seem like a minor raid. But vindication and conquest were different things entirely. Francisco had found evidence of the empire he sought, but his expedition was in no condition to attempt its conquest. His men were sick, exhausted, and reduced to perhaps 60 effectives. His single ship was barely seaworthy after months of coastal sailing. His supplies were nearly exhausted, and he had no idea how far he was from the empire's true center of power. Reluctantly, Francisco made the decision to return to Panama, but this would not be a retreat. It would be a reconnaissance that laid the groundwork for a proper conquest. He spent several more weeks along the Ecuadorian coast, gathering intelligence about the empire's extent and defenses. He collected samples of goldwork that demonstrated the sophistication of native craftsmanship. Most importantly, he captured several natives who could serve as interpreters and guides for the larger expedition he was already planning. The return voyage to Panama took 4 months and nearly killed everyone aboard. Their ship, never reliable to begin with, began falling apart in earnest as soon as they turned north. The crew spent as much time bailing water as sailing, while tropical storms battered them with wind and rain that made navigation nearly impossible. They were reduced to eating leather and drinking their own urine before finally limping into Panama Bay in early 1526. Francisco had left Panama with 80 men and 2 ships. He returned with fewer than 50 men and 1 vessel that sank at its moorings 3 days after reaching port. By any conventional measure, the first expedition to Peru had been a disaster. Francisco had lost nearly half his force without conquering a single town or securing any significant treasure. The citizens of Panama, who had dubbed his partnership the Company of Lunatics, felt their skepticism vindicated. But Francisco understood what his critics did not: that successful conquest required more than immediate victory. Cortés had spent months gathering intelligence about the Aztec Empire before attempting its destruction. Francisco had now done the same with the kingdom his native informants called Biru, or Peru. He knew it existed. He knew where to find it. He knew it was wealthy beyond Spanish dreams. The question now was not whether to attempt its conquest, but how to organize an expedition capable of succeeding where the first had merely survived. The partnership between Francisco, Almagro, and Luque had survived the first expedition's apparent failure, but it would need significant reinforcement for the second attempt. The costs had been enormous: 2 ships lost, equipment destroyed, men dead or permanently disabled. Luque's initial investment was exhausted, and the partners faced the challenge of finding new sources of funding without any concrete treasure to show potential backers. Francisco solved this problem with the same methodical approach he applied to every challenge. Rather than seeking a single wealthy patron, he organized what amounted to a joint stock company among Panama's Spanish residents. Shares in the expedition were sold to anyone with money to invest, from wealthy merchants to ordinary soldiers who contributed their life savings. The investors understood they might lose everything, but the samples of gold work Francisco had brought back convinced many that the potential rewards justified the risks. The second expedition was planned with meticulous attention to the lessons learned during the first voyage. Francisco commissioned the construction of 2 new ships, built specifically for the journey to Peru rather than purchased as aging coastal traders. The vessels were larger and more robust than anything he had commanded before, with reinforced hulls designed to withstand the battering of Pacific storms and holds large enough to carry supplies for extended voyaging. More importantly, the human complement of the second expedition reflected Francisco's growing understanding of what conquest would require. Rather than 80 desperate adventurers, he recruited 160 men, many of them specialists in particular aspects of warfare or administration. The force included experienced cavalry officers who understood how to deploy horses effectively against native armies, crossbowmen whose weapons could penetrate native armor, and craftsmen who could maintain equipment and fortifications during extended campaigns. Francisco also recruited Hernando de Soto, a veteran of Central American campaigns who brought both military experience and his own investment to the enterprise. De Soto was everything Francisco was not: literate, well-born, trained in formal military tactics, but he recognized Francisco's unique combination of determination and pragmatic intelligence. Their partnership would prove crucial in the years ahead, combining Francisco's strategic vision with De Soto's tactical expertise. The second expedition departed Panama in early 1526, but this time Francisco had learned the importance of political preparation as well as military readiness. Before leaving, he had secured formal authorization from Governor Pedro de los Rios, Pedrarias' successor, along with promises of additional support if the initial phase proved successful. More importantly, he had dispatched agents to Spain to seek royal approval for the conquest and to negotiate the terms under which he would govern any territories he managed to conquer. The early stages of the second voyage followed the same route as the first, but Francisco's improved ships and larger crew allowed him to push further south than he had managed previously. The expedition reached the Gulf of Guayaquil, where they encountered clear evidence that they were approaching the periphery of a major empire. The coastal settlements here were larger and more sophisticated than anything they had seen during the first voyage, with buildings constructed from cut stone and harbors that could accommodate vessels much larger than Spanish ships. Most significantly, they encountered Inca administrative officials, quipu keepers and tribute collectors who represented the imperial government in Cusco. These men wore fine clothing decorated with silver and gold, spoke with obvious authority, and commanded the respect of local populations. Through careful questioning, Francisco learned that the empire extended far inland, encompassing millions of people and countless cities, all ruled by a single emperor whom his subjects regarded as a living god. The expedition pushed south along the coast of modern Ecuador, mapping harbors and river mouths while gathering intelligence about the empire's administrative structure. Francisco was no longer simply looking for cities to loot. He was studying an entire civilization, searching for its weaknesses and pressure points. He learned that the empire was divided into 4 great regions, each governed by a provincial administrator who reported directly to the emperor. He discovered that the imperial army was organized around decimal units, with strict hierarchies and standardized equipment. Most importantly, he learned that the empire depended on a sophisticated system of roads and relay stations that could rapidly move information and troops across vast distances. This intelligence gathering was interrupted by disaster. While anchored off the coast near present-day Esmeraldas, Francisco's expedition was struck by a tropical storm of unprecedented violence. The winds reached hurricane force, driving waves high enough to swamp boats and tear anchors from the sea floor. Both Spanish ships were driven onto a lee shore where the larger vessel broke apart in the surf while the smaller rode the waves onto a sandy beach. Francisco found himself in precisely the situation he had spent years trying to avoid, stranded on a hostile coast with inadequate supplies and no means of escape. The wreck of the larger ship had claimed nearly 30 men, along with most of their horses and heavy equipment. The surviving vessel was badly damaged, with a cracked mast and hull planks that would need extensive repair before she could safely attempt the voyage back to Panama. But Francisco had learned from Balboa that apparent disasters often contained unexpected opportunities. The storm that had destroyed his ships had also driven his expedition ashore at exactly the point where the Inca Empire's coastal defenses were weakest. Rather than attempting immediate escape, Francisco decided to use the forced landing as an opportunity for extended reconnaissance. For 3 months, the Spanish lived on the Ecuadorian coast as involuntary guests of local Inca officials. Francisco was careful to present his men as peaceful explorers rather than potential conquerors, and the Inca administrators seemed genuinely curious about these strange visitors from across the ocean. The Spanish were provided with food and shelter while their ship was repaired, and in return they shared information about their distant homeland and demonstrated European technologies that fascinated their hosts. This extended contact allowed Francisco to observe Inca society from the inside. He watched tribute being collected and redistributed according to precise regulations. He saw roads being maintained by corvée labor and relay runners carrying messages across the empire at speeds that seemed impossible. He witnessed religious ceremonies that combined awesome pageantry with evidence of absolute imperial authority. Every detail was memorized and discussed with his officers during their private meetings. Most crucially, Francisco learned of a development that would transform the entire strategic situation. The great emperor Huayna Capac had died several years earlier, and his sons Huáscar and Atahualpa were engaged in a bitter civil war for control of the empire. The conflict had divided the Inca elite, weakened imperial administration, and created exactly the sort of political opportunity that had allowed Cortés to conquer Mexico with a relative handful of Spanish soldiers. When Francisco's repaired ship finally sailed north toward Panama in late 1526, it carried intelligence that would reshape Spanish understanding of South American conquest possibilities. Francisco had not just discovered a wealthy empire, he had found one in the midst of a succession crisis that made it vulnerable to the sort of divide-and-conquer tactics that Spanish conquistadors had perfected in Mexico and Central America. The return to Panama should have been a moment of triumph, but Francisco discovered that success created its own problems. News of his discoveries had spread throughout the Spanish colonies, attracting the attention of rival adventurers who wanted to share in the anticipated conquest of Peru. Governor Pedro de los Rios, initially supportive of Francisco's expeditions, began to worry that the conquest of such a wealthy empire required more experienced leadership than an illiterate former swineherd could provide. More seriously, Francisco learned that his agents in Spain had encountered resistance from royal officials, who questioned his qualifications to govern vast territories. His illegitimate birth, his lack of formal education, and his relatively humble social origins all worked against him in a Spanish court that remained deeply invested in traditional hierarchies of birth and breeding. Other Spanish nobles were petitioning the crown for the right to conquer Peru, arguing that such an important enterprise required leadership from men of proven nobility rather than colonial upstarts. Francisco realized that time was running out. If he delayed much longer, the conquest of Peru would be assigned to someone else, leaving him to watch from the sidelines as other men claimed the empire he had discovered. The third expedition would have to be organized quickly, launched successfully, and completed decisively before rivals could intervene. There would be no opportunity for extended preparation or careful planning. Francisco would have to gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. In late 1530, at the age of 52, Francisco Pizarro stood once again on the docks of Panama City, watching supplies being loaded onto ships that would carry him toward the most important test of his life. Behind him lay 5 years of preparation, 2 previous expeditions, and the accumulated experience of a lifetime spent learning that the world belonged to those determined enough to take it. Ahead lay an empire of millions ruled by a god emperor who commanded armies larger than any force Europe could field. The odds against success were so overwhelming that no rational man would have attempted the conquest. Francisco Pizarro had never been accused of excessive rationality. I'd like to pause here and invite you to subscribe to Michael's Expeditions if you're finding this journey into one of history's most audacious conquests as compelling as I am. We're just getting started on this incredible story, and there's so much more to come. The third expedition to Peru departed Panama on December 27, 1530. Carrying 180 men and 27 horses aboard 3 ships that represented Francisco Pizarro's final gamble on glory. Unlike his previous ventures, this expedition sailed with royal authorization. Charles V had finally granted Francisco the titles of Governor and Captain General of Peru, along with the right to conquer and colonize whatever territories he could claim in the name of Spain. The parchment bearing the royal seal gave Francisco legal authority over an empire he had never seen, but it also committed him to success. Failure would not simply mean death, it would mean the disgrace of having disappointed his king. The fleet's flagship carried Francisco and his core officers, while the 2 smaller vessels transported the expedition's horses, artillery, and the bulk of its supplies. The animals were precious beyond their weight in gold. Horses had proven decisive in every major Spanish conquest, their psychological impact on native armies often worth more than their tactical advantage. Francisco had learned this lesson watching Cortés's letters arrive in Panama, describing how Aztec warriors fled in terror from mounted Spanish knights, who seemed to be centaur-like creatures from another world. Among the men crowding the ship's decks were 4 of Francisco's half-brothers, Hernando, Juan, Gonzalo, and Francisco Martín de Alcántara. The inclusion of so many family members was both practical and symbolic. Practical because Francisco trusted his brothers more than strangers. Symbolic because he was transforming the conquest of Peru into a family enterprise that would either elevate the Pizarro name to greatness or destroy it entirely. Hernando, the only legitimate brother, brought formal education and noble connections. Juan and Gonzalo possessed military experience and the ruthless pragmatism that characterized all the Pizarro siblings. Together they formed a tight command structure bound by blood and shared ambition. The expedition also included Hernando de Soto, whose reputation as a cavalry commander had spread throughout the Spanish colonies. De Soto brought his own followers and equipment, men who had served with him in Nicaragua and knew him as a leader who understood how to keep soldiers alive while achieving military objectives. His presence lent credibility to Francisco's enterprise, signaling to potential recruits that this expedition was organized by serious professionals rather than desperate adventurers. But perhaps the most important passenger aboard Francisco's flagship was a man who carried no weapons and commanded no soldiers. Felipito was a young native of the northern coast who had been captured during Francisco's second expedition and trained as an interpreter. For 3 years, he had lived among the Spanish in Panama, learning their language, while serving as a window into the complex world of Andean civilizations. Felipito understood not just the Quechua language of the Inca Empire, but the cultural assumptions and social hierarchies that shaped how its people understood the world around them. Francisco had invested enormous effort in Felipito's education, recognizing that conquest required communication as much as violence. The young interpreter could explain Spanish concepts to native audiences and translate native responses back into terms Spanish commanders could understand. More importantly, he possessed detailed knowledge of Inca political structures, religious beliefs, and military organization that would prove invaluable during the critical negotiations Francisco anticipated. The voyage south began auspiciously, with favorable winds and calm seas that allowed the fleet to make excellent time along the now familiar coast of Colombia. Francisco had sailed these waters twice before, and the routine of maritime travel had become second nature to him. He spent his days studying the crude maps his previous expeditions had produced, memorizing the locations of safe harbors and reliable sources of fresh water. More importantly, he used the voyage to finalize the strategic plan that would either make him the conqueror of Peru or ensure his death in the attempt. Francisco's strategy was based on careful analysis of how Cortés had conquered Mexico. The key to Spanish success lay not in superior numbers, which they would never possess, but in exploiting divisions within native societies while maximizing the psychological impact of European military technology. Cortés had succeeded by presenting himself as the ally of Aztec enemies, using native auxiliaries to provide the manpower for conquest while Spanish soldiers served as elite shock troops whose steel weapons and mounted charges could break enemy formations at crucial moments. Peru presented similar opportunities. Francisco's intelligence gathering had revealed that the Inca Empire was torn by civil war between the half-brothers Huáscar and Atahualpa, a conflict that had divided the imperial elite and weakened central authority. If he could position himself as the ally of one faction against the other, he might be able to repeat Cortés's success on an even grander scale. The challenge would be making contact with the warring factions and convincing them that Spanish support was worth the price it would inevitably demand. The fleet reached the Gulf of Guayaquil in February 1531, entering waters where Francisco's second expedition had gathered its most valuable intelligence. The coast here showed clear evidence of imperial authority. Harbors constructed with cut stone, settlements laid out according to geometric patterns, and administrative buildings that reflected the Inca Empire's sophisticated bureaucratic organization. But the Civil War's impact was also visible. Many coastal towns appeared to have been recently fortified, while others showed signs of recent battles in the form of burned buildings and hastily constructed defensive positions. Francisco ordered his ships to anchor at Tumbes, a coastal city that his previous reconnaissance had identified as a major imperial stronghold. The city occupied a commanding position on a natural harbor, its walls rising directly from the water's edge to heights that would make assault difficult even for European forces. More importantly, Tumbes served as the administrative center for the empire's northwestern provinces, making it the logical place to establish diplomatic contact with Inca authorities. The Spanish approach to Tumbes was observed from the moment their ships appeared on the horizon. Smoke signals rose from coastal watchtowers, carrying news of the strangers' arrival to officials throughout the region. By the time Francisco's fleet entered the harbor, crowds had gathered along the waterfront to observe these mysterious visitors whose reputation had spread throughout the empire during the years since their previous appearances. Francisco chose his landing party with characteristic care. He would go ashore with 50 men, enough to discourage casual aggression, but not so many as to appear threatening to a city that could probably field several thousand warriors if pressed. The party would include his most reliable officers, his brothers Hernando and Juan, and of course Felipillo, whose linguistic skills would be essential for any meaningful communication. The Spanish landing was met by a formal delegation of Inca officials who had clearly prepared for this moment. The group was led by a curaca, a provincial administrator whose elaborate clothing and obvious authority marked him as a representative of the imperial government. He was accompanied by quipu keepers carrying the knotted cord devices used for record-keeping throughout the empire, along with a substantial guard of professional soldiers whose bronze-tipped spears and cotton armor represented the standard equipment of Inca military forces. Through Felipillo's translation, the curaca welcomed the Spanish to Tumbes while making it clear that their presence required explanation. Who were they? Where had they come from? What was the purpose of their visit? The questions were posed with elaborate courtesy, but Francisco could hear the steel beneath the silk. These were not the primitive chieftains he had encountered during his earlier voyages, but representatives of a sophisticated state that expected visitors to justify their presence according to established protocols. Francisco's response was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity. He explained that he and his men were ambassadors from a great king across the ocean, come to offer friendship and alliance to the ruler of this land. He presented gifts, steel knives, glass beads, and lengths of European cloth, while carefully avoiding any mention of conquest or territorial claims. The goal was to establish peaceful relations while gathering intelligence about the current political situation. The curaca accepted the gifts with formal gratitude while studying the Spanish with obvious fascination. He had clearly received reports about these strange visitors, but seeing them in person was different from hearing descriptions. The steel weapons particularly caught his attention. He examined Francisco's sword with the eye of a professional warrior, noting its superior cutting edge and the impossibility of duplicating such craftsmanship with Bronze Age technology. More significantly, the curaca confirmed what Francisco most needed to know about the Civil War's current status. The conflict between Huáscar and Atahualpa continued to rage, with neither brother able to achieve decisive victory. Atahualpa controlled the northern provinces from his base in Quito, while Huáscar ruled the traditional imperial heartland around Cusco. The curaca's own loyalty appeared to lie with Atahualpa, but he spoke carefully, aware that the political situation remained fluid and that backing the wrong faction could prove fatal. Francisco listened to these revelations with the expression of a man receiving interesting but unimportant news. Privately, however, he was jubilant. The Civil War not only continued but seemed to have intensified, creating exactly the sort of opportunity Spanish conquistadors needed to succeed against overwhelming numerical odds. If he could establish contact with one of the warring factions and offer Spanish military support in exchange for political concessions, he might be able to achieve bloodless conquest of at least part of the empire. The Spanish spent 3 days in Tumbes as guests of the imperial administration, a visit that allowed Francisco to observe Inca society from closer range than ever before. The city impressed him with its scale and sophistication. Perhaps 15,000 inhabitants living in stone houses arranged around carefully planned plazas, supplied with fresh water through an elaborate system of canals and aqueducts. The central plaza contained a temple complex whose walls were decorated with sheets of beaten gold, while the administrative buildings featured stonework so precisely cut that Spanish masons would have struggled to duplicate it. More impressive still was the evident prosperity of ordinary citizens. The markets were full of goods from across the empire. Textiles from highland regions, pottery from specialized craft centers, foodstuffs preserved through techniques unknown to Europeans. The quality of everyday items suggested a level of material wealth that extended far beyond the ruling elite. This was not a primitive society enriched by accident of geography. but a sophisticated civilization that had developed advanced techniques for generating and distributing wealth. Francisco also observed the empire's military organization during his stay in Tumbes. The city's garrison consisted of perhaps 500 professional soldiers, but their equipment and training revealed the sophistication of Inca military doctrine. The troops were organized into decimal units with clear chains of command. Their weapons, while made from bronze rather than steel, were well crafted and standardized. Most importantly, the soldiers demonstrated the discipline and cohesion that characterized truly effective armies. But Francisco also noted weaknesses that might be exploited by Spanish forces. Inca military doctrine appeared to emphasize mass formations and coordinated attacks, tactics that would be vulnerable to the mobile warfare favored by Spanish cavalry. The bronze weapons, while effective against traditional enemies, would be unable to penetrate Spanish steel armor. Most significantly, the empire's military organization was clearly designed for conflicts against other Andean civilizations, rather than the sort of irregular warfare that Spanish conquistadors had perfected through decades of colonial campaigning. On the fourth day, Francisco announced that he and his men would be departing Tumbes to continue their exploratory voyage. The Curica expressed polite regret at their departure while offering assistance for their journey. Francisco accepted this offer, requesting guides who could help his expedition navigate the coastal waters and identify safe landing sites. What he actually wanted were informants who could provide ongoing intelligence about political developments throughout the northern provinces. The Spanish fleet departed Tumbes with 2 native guides aboard the flagship and a wealth of intelligence about the empire's current vulnerabilities. Francisco now understood that the Civil War had created exactly the opportunity he needed, but he also recognized that exploiting that opportunity would require careful timing and precise execution. Moving too quickly might unite the warring factions against the Spanish threat. Moving too slowly might allow the Civil War to end before he could intervene decisively. The expedition continued south along the coast, stopping at smaller ports to gather additional intelligence and establish friendly relations with local administrators. At each stop, Francisco repeated the same careful performance, presenting himself as a peaceful explorer while systematically collecting information about military capabilities, political loyalties, and economic resources. The cumulative intelligence painted a picture of an empire under severe strain, its administrative apparatus stretched thin by the demands of supporting 2 rival armies in a prolonged conflict. By March 1531, Francisco had gathered enough information to finalize his strategic plan. Rather than attempting immediate conquest of the coastal provinces, he would march inland toward the highlands where the Civil War's outcome was being decided. If he could make contact with one of the warring factions and offer Spanish military support at a crucial moment, he might be able to position himself as kingmaker in the imperial succession. Once one brother had defeated the other with Spanish assistance, Francisco could then demand payment in the form of territorial concessions, tribute rights, or even outright control over portions of the empire. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness, but Francisco had learned that audacity often succeeded where caution failed. Cortés had conquered Mexico by seizing the Aztec emperor and ruling through him. Francisco would attempt something even more ambitious. He would help determine who became emperor, then use that person's gratitude to establish Spanish dominion over the wealthiest empire in the New World. The first step required establishing a permanent base of operations on the Peruvian coast. Francisco selected the site of San Miguel de Pura, a location that offered access to both the ocean and the inland routes leading toward the Inca heartland. The Spanish would build a fortified settlement here, complete with church, administrative buildings, and housing for colonists who would follow once the conquest was complete. More immediately, San Miguel would serve as a supply base and refuge for Francisco's forces during their inland campaign. Construction of San Miguel began in May 1531 with the Spanish applying techniques learned during 2 decades of colonial settlement. The town was laid out according to the standard grid pattern used throughout Spanish America, with a central plaza surrounded by lots reserved for the church, government buildings, and the residences of prominent citizens. Defensive walls were built using stone quarried from nearby hills, while the harbor was improved to accommodate Spanish ships that would bring supplies and reinforcements from Panama. The work proceeded slowly, hampered by the need to adapt European building techniques to local materials and climate. The Spanish had brought no architects or master builders, requiring Francisco's soldiers to learn construction trades through trial and error. More significantly, the labor force consisted entirely of Spanish colonists. Francisco had decided not to employ native workers for security reasons, fearing that indigenous laborers might serve as spies for the Inca administration. While San Miguel took shape, Francisco used his remaining time to prepare for the inland march that would determine his expedition's ultimate success or failure. The force that would attempt the conquest of the Inca Empire consisted of 170 Spanish soldiers, 67 of the mounted cavalry whose horses represented the expedition's most valuable military asset. The infantry included 37 crossbowmen whose weapons could penetrate native armor, along with arquebusiers carrying the primitive firearms that were just beginning to appear in European armies. But numbers told only part of the story. Francisco's men were veterans of Caribbean and Central American campaigns who understood how to fight effective colonial warfare with minimal resources. They knew how to live off hostile territory, how to exploit divisions within native populations, and how to maximize the psychological impact of European military technology. Most importantly, they were desperate men who understood that conquest represented their only path to the wealth and status they had crossed an ocean to find. The Spanish also carried technological advantages that went beyond their weapons and horses. They possessed steel tools that could cut through materials impervious to bronze implements. Their armor, while heavy and uncomfortable in tropical heat, was virtually impenetrable to native weapons. They understood the use of gunpowder for both military and engineering purposes. Perhaps most crucially, they carried diseases to which native populations had no immunity. Smallpox, typhus, and measles that would spread ahead of Spanish armies like invisible allies. Francisco spent the summer of 1531 gathering final intelligence about the inland route to Cajamarca, where his native informants reported that Atahualpa was currently holding court with a substantial army. The journey would require crossing the coastal desert, climbing through mountain passes that reached elevations of over 12,000 feet, and traversing territory controlled by populations of unknown loyalty. Spanish horses, bred for European conditions, would struggle in the thin air of the high Andes. Men accustomed to sea-level campaigning would have to adapt to altitude that left them gasping after minimal exertion. But the intelligence also revealed an irresistible opportunity. Atahualpa was reportedly at Cajamarca with only a small portion of his army, perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 men rather than the 20,000 or 30,000 he could command when fully mobilized. The emperor was apparently confident in his security, treating Cajamarca as a secure base rather than a potential battlefield. If Francisco could reach the city quickly before Atahualpa realized the Spanish represented a serious threat, he might be able to repeat Cortés's capture of Montezuma, seizing the emperor and using him to control the empire. On September 24, 1531, Francisco Pizarro made the decision that would transform him from colonial adventurer into historical legend. Standing in the plaza of San Miguel de Piura, addressing the 170 men who would accompany him into the Andes, he spoke words that Pedro Pizarro recorded with obvious emotion. "We go to seek a prince whose ancestors have ruled this land for more than 400 years. We are few, and our enemies are many. We carry steel where they carry bronze, horses where they walk on foot, and most importantly, we carry the favor of God where they worship false idols. With His help, we will achieve what seems impossible to mortal men." The speech was calculated theater, designed to inspire confidence while acknowledging the enormous risks ahead. Francisco knew his men well enough to understand that they needed both encouragement and honesty. False optimism would shatter at the first sign of serious resistance, while excessive pessimism might discourage volunteers from beginning the march. The reference to divine favor served multiple purposes, providing religious justification for the conquest while suggesting that Spanish victory was predetermined by higher powers. The inland march began before dawn on September 24th, with the Spanish cavalry riding in column while the infantry followed on foot. Each man carried his personal weapons and equipment while pack horses transported the expedition's supplies and the artillery pieces that Francisco hoped would prove decisive in any major battle. The column stretched for nearly a mile along the narrow track that led inland from the coast, its progress marked by a dust cloud visible for miles in the clear desert air. The first stage of the journey took the Spanish across the Sechura Desert, a landscape of sand dunes and scattered scrub vegetation that seemed designed to discourage human travel. The sun beat down with intensity that made steel armor almost unbearable, while the lack of reliable water sources forced careful rationing of the expedition's limited supplies. Men began to understand why the Inca Empire's coastal subjects had never attempted rebellion. The desert formed a natural barrier that made large-scale military movement almost impossible. But Francisco had prepared for these challenges during his months at San Miguel. The expedition carried enough water for 10 days of desert travel, while native guides led them to wells and springs that dotted the landscape at carefully spaced intervals. The Spanish also benefited from careful timing. The march had begun during the dry season when travel was difficult but possible, avoiding the flash floods that could turn dry arroyos into raging torrents within minutes. After a week of desert travel, the Spanish reached the foothills of the Andes, where the landscape began its dramatic transformation from coastal desert to highland plateau. The track they followed had been constructed by Inca engineers as part of the empire's sophisticated road system, with stone-paved surfaces, carefully graded climbs, and way stations where official travelers could rest and resupply. Francisco recognized the military significance of this infrastructure. The roads that eased his approach to Cajamarca could also speed Inca reinforcements to any threatened position. The climb into the mountains revealed the true scale of the empire Francisco was attempting to conquer. Terraced agricultural fields covered every available slope, representing an investment in labor that must have required generations to complete. Villages perched on seemingly impossible precipices connected to the main road system by paths cut directly into cliff faces. Suspension bridges spanned gorges so deep that their bottoms disappeared into shadow, engineering marvels that allowed foot traffic to cross obstacles that would have stopped European armies entirely. Most impressive was the evident prosperity of the highland population. The Spanish passed through settlements whose inhabitants were clearly well-fed and adequately clothed despite living in conditions that would have meant grinding poverty in Europe. The agricultural terraces produced surpluses that supported not just local populations, but the elaborate administrative and military apparatus of imperial government. Francisco was not marching through a primitive society enriched by lucky accident, but through one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. The cultural sophistication was matched by military preparedness. Every significant settlement contained warehouses stocked with weapons, armor, and preserved food sufficient to supply imperial armies during extended campaigns. Way stations along the road system were fortified and garrisoned, while signal fires on mountaintops could communicate news across hundreds of miles within hours. Francisco realized he was not simply invading a country, he was challenging a military machine of unprecedented efficiency and scale. But the empire's very sophistication created vulnerabilities that Spanish forces might exploit. The road system that impressed Francisco also revealed imperial dependence on centralized control. The terraced agriculture required constant maintenance by coordinated labor forces. The signal fire network could carry news quickly, but it could also be disrupted by small forces operating behind enemy lines. Most importantly, the entire system depended on political unity at the top. If that unity could be shattered, the empire's complex administrative apparatus might collapse from within. As the Spanish climbed higher into the Andes, they began to experience the physical effects of high-altitude travel. Men accustomed to sea-level exertion found themselves gasping for breath after minimal effort. Horses struggled with loads they could have carried easily in lowland conditions. The cold was more intense than any European winter, while the thin air made fires difficult to maintain and food slow to cook. Francisco watched his men adapt to these conditions with the same stoic determination they had shown during years of Caribbean campaigning. The expedition's progress was closely monitored by Inca officials, who reported regularly to Atahualpa's court at Cajamarca. Francisco made no attempt to conceal his movements. Concealment was impossible with a column of 170 men and 67 horses, but he also avoided any actions that might be interpreted as overtly hostile. When local administrators approached under flags of truce, he received them courteously and repeated his claim to be a peaceful ambassador seeking audience with the great lord of this land. These diplomatic contacts served Francisco's purposes perfectly. They reinforced his peaceful intentions while providing opportunities to gather intelligence about Atahualpa's forces and dispositions. More importantly, they established his credentials as a legitimate diplomatic agent rather than a mere raider, potentially crucial for the negotiations he anticipated once contact was established with the imperial court. By mid-November, the Spanish had reached the final approaches to Cajamarca, climbing through mountain passes that offered commanding views of the valley where Atahualpa waited with his army. Francisco called a halt to study the terrain and finalize his plans for what would prove to be the most important encounter in the history of the New World. Below them, spread across the valley floor, lay the city of Cajamarca and the military camps of an empire that had never known defeat. The moment of truth was approaching, and Francisco Pizarro understood that everything he had worked for during 15 years in the New World would be decided by what happened next. The valley of Cajamarca stretched below the Spanish like a bowl carved from the living rock of the Andes, its floor a patchwork of cultivated fields and grazing lands that spoke of centuries of careful husbandry. The city itself occupied the valley's center, its stone buildings arranged in precise geometric patterns around a vast central plaza that could have held 10,000 people. But it was not the city that commanded Francisco's attention as he studied the scene through the thin mountain air. It was the military encampment that sprawled across the valley's northern slopes, like a second city built entirely of cloth and bronze. Atahualpa's army covered nearly a square mile of hillside, organized into perfect rows of tents and pavilions that demonstrated the mathematical precision of Inca military doctrine. From Francisco's vantage point high above the valley floor, the camp resembled nothing so much as a vast textile spread across the landscape, its geometric patterns visible even at a distance of several miles. Smoke rose from countless cooking fires while the movement of men between the tent rows created streams of color that flowed through the encampment like water through an irrigation system. Pedro Pizarro, who stood beside his cousin during that first survey of Cajamarca, would later write, "We looked down upon a sight that no Christian army in Europe could have matched for order and magnificence. The emperor's tent stood at the camp's center like a golden jewel surrounded by lesser stones, while around it stretched pavilions housing warriors from every corner of the empire." My cousin Francisco studied this spectacle with the expression of a man calculating impossible odds, but when he turned to address us, his voice carried nothing but confidence. That confidence was carefully manufactured. Francisco understood that his men needed to believe success was possible, even as he privately calculated the enormity of the challenge they faced. Conservative estimates suggested that Atahualpa commanded at least 8,000 professional soldiers at Cajamarca, with the potential to summon perhaps 20,000 more from surrounding garrisons if he felt threatened. Against this force, Francisco could deploy 168 Spanish soldiers and their horses, odds of nearly 50 to 1. Even before accounting for additional reserves that might be called upon. But Francisco had learned from studying Cortés's conquest of Mexico that raw numbers meant less than strategic position and psychological advantage. The key was not to defeat Atahualpa's army in open battle, an impossibility with Spanish forces, but to seize the emperor himself and use imperial authority structures to control the empire from within. If Atahualpa could be captured and made compliant, his own administrative apparatus would become the instrument of Spanish rule. The plan that formed in Francisco's mind as he studied the valley below was breathtaking in its audacity. Rather than establishing a fortified position outside Cajamarca and negotiating from a position of defensive strength, he would march directly into the city and request an audience with Atahualpa. When the emperor arrived for that meeting, Francisco would spring a trap that would either secure the conquest of Peru in a single afternoon or result in the annihilation of his entire force. Francisco spent 2 days in the mountains above Cajamarca, ostensibly resting his men and horses while actually finalizing every detail of the ambush he planned to execute. The Spanish would enter the city openly, occupying the buildings around the central plaza while maintaining the pretense of peaceful diplomatic contact. Cavalry would be concealed in structures on the plaza's northern and southern sides, positioned to charge across the open space when Francisco gave the signal. Infantry would occupy the buildings on the eastern and western sides, their crossbows and harquebuses aimed at the plaza's center, where Atahualpa would be invited to meet his visitors. The success of this plan depended entirely on Atahualpa's cooperation. The emperor would have to agree to meet the Spanish. He would have to come to that meeting with a guard small enough for Spanish forces to overwhelm. Most crucially, he would have to enter the plaza without suspecting the trap that awaited him there. Any of these assumptions could prove false, in which case the Spanish would find themselves trapped in the heart of Cajamarca with an enraged imperial army bearing down upon them. On November 15, 1532, Francisco made his final preparations for the march into Cajamarca. He assembled his officers in a natural amphitheater formed by the mountain rocks, where he could address them without being overheard by the common soldiers. What he told them there would never be recorded in official chronicles, but the substance can be inferred from what followed. Francisco was asking these men to stake their lives on a plan so desperate that failure would mean not just death, but death preceded by torture that would make their final moments a warning to other Europeans who might contemplate similar adventures. Francisco López de Xerez, the expedition's secretary, described the mood among the Spanish soldiers on the eve of their entry into Cajamarca. The men spent the night in prayer and preparation, checking their weapons and armor with the care of soldiers who know that the morning will bring either victory or martyrdom. Some wrote letters they hoped might somehow reach their families in Spain. Others confessed their sins to Father Valverde, seeking absolution before what many expected to be their final battle. But none spoke of retreat or surrender. We had come too far and risked too much to turn back when our goal lay within reach. The Spanish column that descended into the Cajamarca Valley on the morning of November 16, 1532, was unlike any military force the Inca Empire had ever encountered. The cavalry rode in tight formation, their steel armor gleaming in the thin mountain sunlight, while the infantry followed in disciplined ranks that spoke of professional training and combat experience. Spanish banners snapped in the highland wind, their bright colors visible across the valley as Francisco led his men toward their appointment with history. The approach to Cajamarca took most of the morning, with the Spanish following the imperial road that connected the valley to the larger network of highways spanning the empire. Along the way, they passed through checkpoints manned by Inca officials who observed the European column with obvious fascination but made no attempt to obstruct its passage. Francisco had sent messengers ahead announcing his peaceful intentions and requesting an audience with the great lord of the land. The imperial bureaucracy, trained to handle diplomatic contacts according to established procedures, was processing his request through proper channels. As the Spanish entered Cajamarca itself, they found a city that exceeded even Francisco's expectations. The buildings were constructed from precisely fitted stone blocks that required no mortar, yet were assembled so perfectly that a knife blade could not be inserted between them. The streets were paved and drained according to engineering principles that would not be matched in Europe for several centuries. Public fountains provided clean water throughout the city, while extensive marketplaces offered goods from every corner of the empire. But most striking was the city's emptiness. Cajamarca normally housed perhaps 15,000 residents, yet the Spanish encountered only a few hundred people as they made their way toward the central plaza. The civilian population had clearly been evacuated or ordered to remain indoors, leaving the city feeling like an elaborate stage prepared for some great performance. Francisco understood the message. Atahualpa was demonstrating that he controlled every aspect of the coming encounter, from the setting to the cast of characters who would participate. The central plaza of Cajamarca was vast enough to hold several thousand people, its stone-paved surface surrounded by single-story buildings that would serve perfectly for Francisco's intended ambush. The Spanish took possession of these structures with the methodical efficiency of veteran soldiers, positioning cavalry in the buildings with the largest doorways while placing infantry and artillery where their weapons could command the greatest fields of fire. To any casual observer, the Spanish appeared to be simply establishing quarters for a diplomatic delegation. In reality, they were constructing an elaborate trap. Francisco established his own headquarters in the building that faced the plaza's eastern side, positioning himself where he could observe everything that occurred in the open space while remaining close enough to the action to direct his men when the critical moment arrived. From his vantage point, he could see clear across the valley to Atahualpa's military camp, where thousands of warriors continued their daily routines, apparently unaware that their emperor was about to walk into mortal danger. The Spanish spent the afternoon of November 16th in final preparations for the ambush they would attempt the following day. Francisco had sent another message to Atahualpa, requesting a meeting in the plaza at midday to discuss matters of mutual interest between their respective sovereigns. The emperor had agreed to the meeting, but had provided no details about how many men he would bring or what precautions he might take. Francisco was planning for multiple contingencies, but the success of his strategy ultimately depended on factors beyond his control. Father Vicente de Valverde, the expedition's chaplain, spent the evening moving among the Spanish soldiers, offering spiritual preparation for what many expected to be their final day on Earth. The priest's presence served multiple purposes, providing genuine religious comfort while also reinforcing the ideological framework that justified Spanish conquest. The men were not mere adventurers seeking personal enrichment, but Christian soldiers carrying European civilization to pagan lands that would benefit from exposure to superior religion and government. But ideology provided cold comfort to men who understood the mathematical reality of their situation. Francisco commanded fewer than 200 soldiers against an empire of millions. Even if the ambush succeeded perfectly and Atahualpa was captured without significant Spanish losses, they would still face the challenge of controlling a hostile population spread across territory larger than Spain itself. Success at Cajamarca would solve the immediate tactical problem while creating strategic challenges that might prove equally insurmountable. Francisco spent his final evening of preparation and conference with his senior officers, refining the details of the ambush while addressing concerns about what might follow success. Hernando de Soto argued for a more cautious approach, suggesting that the Spanish establish defensive positions outside the city and negotiate from a position of relative security. Francisco's brother, Hernando, favored the audacious course, pointing out that half measures would likely result in failure against such overwhelming odds. The debate revealed fundamental differences in strategic thinking among the Spanish leadership. The professional soldiers like De Soto understood conventional military doctrine, which emphasized secure supply lines, defensive positions, and carefully calculated risks. The conquistadors like Francisco and his brothers had learned different lessons from years of colonial warfare, where audacity often succeeded where caution failed, and where the appearance of strength could be more valuable than actual military superiority. Francisco listened to all arguments before making his final decision. The ambush would proceed as planned, with modifications that addressed some of his officers' concerns. Spanish cavalry would be positioned to block the plaza's exits, preventing Atahualpa's escape while also deterring his guards from fighting to the death. Infantry would be instructed to capture rather than kill imperial officials whenever possible, recognizing that living prisoners would be more valuable than dead martyrs for maintaining Spanish control after the battle. The night of November 16th, 1532, was one of the longest in Spanish colonial history. Francisco's men tried to sleep in the buildings surrounding the plaza, but few managed more than fitful dozing between periods of weapon maintenance and nervous conversation. The horses sensed their riders' tension, stamping and snorting in their improvised stables while Spanish cavaliers checked and rechecked their equipment. Outside, the lights of Atahualpa's camp glowed like fallen stars across the valley, a constant reminder of the forces that would descend upon Cajamarca if the ambush failed. Francisco himself spent much of the night walking among his men, offering encouragement while conducting final inspections of their positions. He checked the placement of artillery pieces that would provide covering fire during the critical opening moments of the ambush. He reviewed hand signals with cavalry commanders who would need to coordinate their charges across the plaza's width. Most importantly, he reminded every man of his specific role in the complex choreography that would either secure Spanish victory or ensure their collective destruction. Dawn came early to the high Andes, with pale light filtering through the thin air to illuminate the stone buildings of Cajamarca. Francisco rose before his men, using the quiet morning hours for final prayers and contemplation of the day ahead. He understood that by sunset, he would either be master of the wealthiest empire in the New World or dead in the plaza he was preparing to turn into a battlefield. There would be no middle ground, no opportunity for retreat or negotiation once the ambush began. The morning hours passed slowly as the Spanish waited for word from Atahualpa's camp. Francisco had received confirmation that the emperor would arrive at midday for the requested meeting, but no details about his escort or intentions. Spanish scouts posted in buildings overlooking the valley reported normal activity in the imperial camp with no obvious preparations for military action. Either Atahualpa suspected nothing, or he was concealing his preparations with the same skill that Francisco was hiding his own. As midday approached, Francisco positioned himself at a window overlooking the plaza, where he could observe Atahualpa's arrival while remaining concealed from imperial eyes. Around the square, his men crouched in their assigned positions, weapons ready and eyes fixed on the empty space where the fate of continents would be decided. The silence was broken only by the distant sounds of normal city life and the whispered prayers of men preparing to bet their lives on a single throw of fortune's dice. Then, shortly after the sun reached its zenith, movement appeared at the plaza's northern entrance. Francisco felt his heart begin to race as he realized that Atahualpa was approaching exactly as hoped, with a substantial retinue that demonstrated imperial dignity, but not the overwhelming force that would make Spanish resistance impossible. The emperor was walking directly into the trap that would either secure his capture or precipitate the bloodiest massacre in New World history. The procession that entered the plaza of Cajamarca that November afternoon was unlike anything Europeans had witnessed in the New World. Atahualpa traveled in a golden litter carried by 80 nobles whose rank was indicated by the elaborate featherwork that decorated their clothing. The emperor himself was dressed in robes of vicuña wool so fine that Spanish observers compared it to silk, while his headdress contained emeralds larger than European walnuts. Golden ornaments caught the highland sun as the procession moved across the plaza, creating a display of wealth that exceeded the most extravagant European ceremonies. But Francisco's attention focused not on imperial splendor, but on military details that would determine the ambush's success. Atahualpa's escort numbered approximately 500 men, including personal guards armed with bronze-headed maces and ceremonial weapons that emphasized their ceremonial rather than practical function. These were court nobles rather than professional soldiers, men selected for their political reliability and social status rather than their combat effectiveness. The emperor had clearly not anticipated serious military resistance. More importantly, Atahualpa had positioned himself exactly where Francisco needed him to be. The golden litter was placed in the plaza's center, surrounded by the imperial retinue but not protected by defensive positions or escape routes that would complicate Spanish plans. The emperor was displaying the absolute confidence of a ruler who had never encountered serious opposition, presenting himself as a target that Spanish forces could engage with reasonable hope of success. Francisco waited until the imperial procession had completed its ceremonial entrance and Atahualpa was settled on his throne-like litter in the plaza's center. Then he nodded to Father Valverde, who emerged from concealment carrying a crucifix and a copy of the Bible. The priest's role was to provide legal justification for what would follow by offering Atahualpa the opportunity to submit peacefully to Spanish authority and Christian conversion. When that offer was inevitably rejected, the Spanish would be able to claim they had attempted peaceful resolution before resorting to violence. Valverde approached Atahualpa's litter with the confidence of a man backed by hidden armies, delivering a speech that Felipillo translated into Quechua with obvious nervousness. The priest explained that he represented a great king from across the ocean, who ruled by authority of the Christian God, and that Atahualpa was invited to acknowledge this superior authority while accepting the true religion that would bring salvation to his people. As expected, the emperor responded with polite but firm rejection, explaining that he acknowledged no earthly superior and worshipped gods who had served his ancestors for countless generations. The theological debate that followed was brief and entirely predictable. Atahualpa examined the Bible that Valverde offered, found that the book remained stubbornly silent when he held it to his ear, and threw it to the ground as a demonstration that Spanish religious claims were false. Valverde retrieved the sacred text while shouting that the emperor had insulted God and forfeited any right to mercy. The priest then turned toward Francisco's position and raised his crucifix, the signal that began the most decisive 15 minutes in New World history. Francisco emerged from his concealment with sword drawn, shouting the battle cry that had echoed across 2 decades of Spanish conquest, Santiago and at them. The words served as both invocation of divine assistance and signal for coordinated attack, releasing Spanish forces from concealment around the plaza's perimeter. Cavalry burst from the northern and southern buildings while infantry emerged from eastern and western positions, their weapons aimed at the crowd of imperial nobles who suddenly found themselves surrounded by steel and death. The psychological impact of the Spanish attack was even more devastating than Francisco had hoped. Atahualpa's retinue had never encountered European military technology, and their first experience came in the form of cavalry charges that seemed to bring supernatural warriors into battle. Horses were unknown in the New World, making mounted Spanish soldiers appear to be centaur-like creatures from another realm of existence. The sound of steel striking bronze, the crash of harquebuses firing in enclosed spaces, and the screams of wounded men created a cacophony that shattered imperial composure within seconds. But the Spanish also faced unexpected challenges as their carefully planned ambush unfolded in the chaos of actual combat. Atahualpa's guards, despite their ceremonial appearance, fought with the desperate courage of men defending their god emperor. Some threw themselves at Spanish horses in attempts to bring down the mounted soldiers, while others formed protective circles around the imperial litter despite the futility of bronze weapons against steel armor. Their resistance was brief but fierce, requiring Spanish forces to fight harder than anticipated to secure their objectives. Francisco himself led the charge toward Atahualpa's litter, recognizing that the entire battle depended on securing the emperor's person before imperial forces could organize effective resistance. Fighting his way through the press of defending nobles, he reached the golden platform where Atahualpa sat with the frozen composure of a man watching his world collapse around him. The emperor made no attempt to flee or fight, but observed the Spanish assault with the detached interest of a natural philosopher studying an unusual phenomenon. The capture of Atahualpa required physical violence that Francisco had hoped to avoid. Imperial guards continued their desperate defense even after the battle's outcome became clear, forcing Spanish soldiers to cut down men whose only crime was loyalty to their legitimate sovereign. Francisco himself sustained a minor wound, the only Spanish casualty of the entire battle, when his sword hand was cut by a ceremonial knife wielded by a dying noble who used his final breath to strike at the man who was destroying his world. Within 15 minutes, the plaza of Cajamarca had been transformed from a scene of imperial pageantry into a charnel house, where hundreds of Inca nobles lay dead or dying among the scattered symbols of their shattered civilization. Atahualpa sat motionless on his captured litter, surrounded by Spanish soldiers whose steel weapons had just demonstrated the obsolescence of Bronze Age military technology. The emperor, who had entered the plaza as master of 10 million subjects, found himself a prisoner whose empire now belonged to fewer than 200 Spanish adventurers. Francisco ordered his men to cease their slaughter once Atahualpa was secured, recognizing that living prisoners would be more valuable than dead enemies for the political negotiations that would follow. The surviving imperial nobles, perhaps 50 men from the 500 who had entered the plaza, were herded into one of the buildings surrounding the square, where they could be guarded while Spanish leaders decided their fate. The most important prize, however, was Atahualpa himself, who would serve as the key to controlling an empire larger than any European kingdom. The emperor's first words to his captors revealed the psychological sophistication that had made him master of the Andes. Rather than pleading for mercy or expressing outrage at Spanish treachery, Atahualpa calmly inquired about Spanish intentions regarding his person and his empire. He understood immediately that Francisco needed him alive and cooperative, giving him bargaining power despite his military defeat. The game of conquest would continue, but now it would be played according to different rules. Francisco's response demonstrated equal sophistication in the art of managing conquered enemies. He assured Atahualpa that no harm would come to the imperial person, explaining that Spanish custom required respectful treatment of legitimate monarchs even during periods of political disagreement. What Francisco did not say was equally important. He made no immediate demands for territorial concessions or tribute payments, recognizing that such discussions required careful preparation and optimal timing. The Spanish spent the remainder of November 16th securing their impossible victory while beginning the complex process of transforming military success into political control. Guards were posted around Atahualpa's quarters to prevent rescue attempts, while patrols were organized to monitor the imperial army camped outside Cajamarca. Most crucially, Francisco dispatched messengers to Spanish positions throughout the region, spreading news of the emperor's capture while requesting reinforcements for the challenges that lay ahead. The imperial army's reaction to Atahualpa's capture would determine whether Spanish success at Cajamarca marked the beginning of conquest or merely a spectacular prelude to annihilation. 8,000 Inca warriors remained encamped within striking distance of the city, commanded by generals whose loyalty to their imprisoned emperor was balanced against their responsibility for preserving imperial military forces. If they chose to attack Cajamarca immediately, Spanish forces would be overwhelmed despite their technological advantages. If they chose to negotiate, Francisco might be able to consolidate his position and begin the systematic conquest of Peru. As night fell over the valley of Cajamarca, Francisco stood in the plaza where his men had changed the course of world history, surrounded by evidence of Spanish victory but acutely aware of how precarious that victory remained. He had captured the most powerful emperor in the Americas, but controlling an empire of 10 million people would require resources far beyond his current capabilities. The greatest test of his career was just beginning. The morning of November 17, 1532, dawned gray and cold over Cajamarca, with clouds pressing low against the surrounding peaks like a burial shroud. Francisco Pizarro stood at the window of his commandeered quarters, studying the imperial army that remained motionless in its camp across the valley. For 12 hours, 8,000 Inca warriors had maintained perfect discipline despite witnessing their god emperor's capture, a restraint that spoke either of remarkable military training or careful political calculation. Francisco knew that the next few hours would determine whether Spanish audacity had secured the conquest of Peru or merely delayed its inevitable revenge. Atahualpa spent his first night of captivity with the composure of a man accustomed to absolute authority, even when that authority had been temporarily circumvented by superior force. The Spanish had provided him with quarters befitting his imperial dignity. The finest building in Cajamarca, furnished with textiles and golden ornaments hastily gathered from the plaza after the massacre. But comfort could not disguise the reality that the master of 10 million subjects was now dependent on the goodwill of fewer than 200 foreign soldiers whose intentions remained unclear. Francisco's immediate challenge was managing the psychological warfare that would determine the conquest's ultimate success. He needed to demonstrate Spanish strength, while avoiding actions that might provoke the imperial army to desperate measures. More importantly, he had to establish a working relationship with Atahualpa that would allow him to rule Peru through existing imperial structures rather than attempting direct Spanish administration of territory he could never hope to control with his limited forces. The key to this delicate balance lay in understanding Inca concepts of legitimate authority. The emperor was not merely a political leader, but a divine figure whose person embodied the empire's spiritual and temporal power. His capture created a constitutional crisis that paralyzed imperial decision-making. since military commanders lacked authority to act independently in situations not covered by established precedent. Francisco could exploit this paralysis, but only if he avoided pushing imperial officials toward desperate measures that might reunite the fractured empire against Spanish rule. Francisco's first meeting with his imperial prisoner took place in the building where Atahualpa had been housed, a stone structure whose walls were decorated with geometric patterns that demonstrated the mathematical sophistication of Inca architecture. The emperor received his captor with the formal courtesy appropriate to diplomatic contact between sovereign rulers, offering no acknowledgement that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by the previous day's violence. This studied normality was itself a form of negotiation, establishing Atahualpa's continued claim to imperial dignity despite his military defeat. The conversation that followed would be remembered as one of history's most remarkable diplomatic encounters, a dialogue between civilizations conducted in a room where armed Spanish soldiers stood guard over the most powerful ruler in the Americas. Francisco, speaking through his interpreter Felipilo, began by expressing regret that their initial meeting had been marked by violence, explaining that Spanish custom required them to respond forcefully when their religious beliefs were insulted. The responsibility for bloodshed, he suggested, lay with imperial advisors who had counseled resistance rather than peaceful accommodation. Atahualpa's response revealed the keen intelligence that had made him master of the Andes. Rather than disputing Spanish claims about the previous day's events, he shifted the conversation toward practical questions about his captor's ultimate intentions. Were they representatives of a distant monarch seeking tributary relationships with American kingdoms? Were they traders hoping to establish commercial connections with the empire's extensive markets? Or were they conquistadors who intended to replace imperial authority with their own administrative systems? Francisco's answer was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity. He explained that he served a great king whose dominions extended across vast territories, but who preferred ruling through existing authorities rather than imposing direct control over distant provinces. The Spanish sought friendship and alliance with the Inca Empire, recognizing Atahualpa's legitimate sovereignty while hoping to establish mutually beneficial relationships that would enrich both civilizations. What he carefully avoided saying was equally important. No mention of territorial conquest, religious conversion, or the systematic plundering that characterized Spanish colonial policy throughout the Americas. This diplomatic dance might have continued indefinitely, but Atahualpa introduced a proposal that transformed the entire negotiation. If his freedom was the obstacle to establishing peaceful relations between their peoples, he was prepared to offer compensation that would satisfy Spanish desires for wealth while demonstrating imperial goodwill. The emperor gestured toward the walls of the room where they sat, explaining that he could fill the entire space with gold to the height of a man's reach, plus an adjoining room filled twice over with silver, if Francisco would agree to release him and withdraw Spanish forces from imperial territory. The offer was so extraordinary that Francisco required several moments to comprehend its full implications. The room where they negotiated was approximately 22 feet long by 17 feet wide, with walls that rose 9 feet to the ceiling. Filling such a space with gold would require hundreds of tons of precious metal, more wealth than existed in all of Europe combined. Even if Atahualpa could deliver only a fraction of what he promised, the Spanish would secure riches beyond their most optimistic dreams. But Francisco understood that accepting the ransom proposal would create as many problems as it solved. Releasing Atahualpa would restore imperial unity and eliminate the constitutional paralysis that currently prevented organized resistance to Spanish occupation. More dangerously, it would signal Spanish weakness by suggesting that Francisco's forces were raiders rather than conquerors, men who could be bought off rather than challenged militarily. The emperor's offer was simultaneously genuine and strategic, designed to test Spanish resolve while potentially providing a face-saving exit from an impossible situation. Francisco requested time to consider the proposal, explaining that such important decisions required consultation with his senior officers. Privately, however, he was already calculating how to exploit Atahualpa's offer for maximum Spanish advantage. Rather than simply accepting or rejecting the ransom, he would use the collection process to extend Spanish control throughout the empire, while systematically weakening imperial resistance to permanent occupation. The Spanish officers who gathered that evening to discuss Atahualpa's proposal were divided along predictable lines. Hernando de Soto argued for accepting the ransom and withdrawing to establish a more secure Spanish base on the coast, pointing out that their current position was militarily indefensible against determined imperial resistance. Francisco's brother Hernando favored using the ransom collection as cover for extending Spanish control throughout the highlands, gathering intelligence and securing strategic positions while appearing to negotiate in good faith. Francisco listened to all arguments before announcing his decision. The Spanish would accept Atahualpa's ransom offer, but with conditions that served their strategic objectives rather than imperial interests. The gold and silver would be collected from temples and palaces throughout the empire, requiring Spanish expeditions to supervise the gathering process in major cities from Quito to Cusco. These expeditions would serve dual purposes, ensuring that the ransom was actually paid while establishing Spanish presence in population centers that could become bases for permanent occupation. More importantly, Francisco imposed a timeline that would keep Atahualpa captive for at least 6 months while the ransom was assembled. This delay would prevent immediate imperial reunification while allowing time for Spanish reinforcements to arrive from Panama and other Caribbean colonies. By the time the ransom was complete, Francisco hoped to have sufficient forces in Peru to maintain Spanish control regardless of whether Atahualpa was released. The ransom agreement was formalized on November 20th, 1532, with Atahualpa placing his mark on a document that Francisco's secretary López de Xerez carefully drafted in Spanish legal terminology. The emperor agreed to fill the designated room with gold and 2 adjoining rooms with silver within 8 months, while Francisco promised to release him and respect his imperial authority once the payment was complete. Both parties understood the agreement's duplicitous nature. Atahualpa was buying time to organize resistance, while Francisco was using the ransom as justification for extending Spanish control throughout Peru. The collection process began immediately, with Spanish expeditions departing Cajamarca for major imperial centers, where accumulated wealth could be gathered according to the ransom agreement. Hernando Pizarro led the most important mission to Cajamarca, a coastal religious center whose temples reportedly contained enough gold to fill several rooms the size of Atahualpa's prison. Other expeditions departed for Quito, Jaua, and eventually Cusco itself, each carrying Spanish soldiers who would establish permanent positions while ostensibly serving temporary functions. The Spanish who ventured into the imperial heartland during those winter months of 1532 and 1533 witnessed wonders that staggered their European understanding of civilization and wealth. Hernando Pizarro's expedition to Cajamarca followed roads that were better engineered than anything in Spain, passing through agricultural terraces that had been carved from mountainsides with mathematical precision. The temple complex itself contained buildings whose walls were literally covered with sheets of beaten gold, creating surfaces that gleamed like captured sunlight even in the gray coastal weather. But the Spanish also observed signs of the political crisis that Atahualpa's capture had created throughout the empire. In many towns, local administrators seemed paralyzed by uncertainty about their authority to comply with Spanish demands for tribute payment. Some regions appeared to be in open rebellion against imperial control, with local chiefs asserting independence while the central government remained unable to respond effectively. The empire that had seemed so monolithically powerful was revealing internal fractures that Spanish intervention was steadily widening. Meanwhile, Francisco maintained his careful management of the captive emperor, allowing Atahualpa to conduct limited governmental business while ensuring that all important decisions required Spanish approval. Imperial messengers arrived regularly at Cajamarca carrying reports from provincial administrators and requests for guidance on how to respond to Spanish demands. Francisco monitored this correspondence carefully, using imperial communications to map the empire's administrative structure while identifying potential allies and enemies among the native leadership. The psychological warfare between captor and captive intensified as both men recognized that their initial agreement was merely the opening move in a more complex game. Atahualpa tested the boundaries of his confinement by requesting permission to travel to nearby religious sites, ostensibly for spiritual observances, but actually to assess possibilities for escape or rescue. Francisco denied these requests while offering compensatory privileges: better quarters, more elaborate meals, access to imperial wives and concubines who had followed the court to Cajamarca. More significantly, Francisco began introducing Atahualpa to Spanish concepts of government and religion, using these educational sessions to evaluate the emperor's potential value as a puppet ruler. The Spanish had learned from their Mexican experiences that compliant native monarchs could provide legitimacy for colonial administration while reducing the manpower requirements for permanent occupation. If Atahualpa could be convinced or coerced into accepting Spanish overlordship, Francisco might be able to govern Peru through existing imperial structures rather than replacing them with direct European control. The religious dimension of these discussions proved particularly complex as Father Valverde attempted to instruct Atahualpa in Christian theology, while the emperor responded with sophisticated questions about European beliefs that often confounded his instructors. Inca religion was not primitive sun worship, but a complex theological system that incorporated concepts of divine authority, moral responsibility, and spiritual transformation that paralleled many Christian ideas. Atahualpa's questions about the Trinity, the nature of salvation, and the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority demonstrated intellectual capabilities that impressed even Spanish observers who remained committed to European superiority. But theological discussions could not obscure the fundamental political reality that Spanish control depended ultimately on military force rather than moral authority. As winter turned towards spring in the southern hemisphere, Francisco received increasingly disturbing reports from his expeditions in the field. The collection of ransom gold was proceeding slowly, hampered by transport difficulties and what appeared to be deliberate imperial obstruction. More ominously, Spanish scouts reported that large Inca armies were assembling in the regions around Quito and Cusco, ostensibly to maintain order during the political crisis, but possibly to prepare coordinated resistance to Spanish occupation. The arrival of Spanish reinforcements from Panama in early 1533 provided Francisco with additional military capability while creating new political complications. The reinforcements included veteran soldiers who expected immediate rewards for their service, along with colonial officials who questioned Francisco's unilateral decisions about governing conquered territory. More problematically, the new arrivals included rivals who had their own claims to leadership roles in the Peruvian conquest, men who argued that Francisco's current position had been achieved through luck rather than superior capability. Chief among these rivals was Diego de Almagro, Francisco's former partner, who had remained in Panama to organize additional support for the conquest. Almagro arrived in April 1533 with 500 fresh soldiers and a royal commission that potentially superseded Francisco's authority over southern portions of the conquered territory. The reunion between the former partners was cordial but strained, as both men understood that their collaboration would continue only as long as their interests remained aligned. Almagro's arrival forced Francisco to accelerate his timeline for completing the conquest, since delay would allow his rival to establish competing claims to the most valuable portions of imperial territory. The ransom collection was therefore declared complete in May 1533, despite containing substantially less gold and silver than Atahualpa had originally promised. The emperor protested that Spanish impatience had prevented full compliance with their agreement, but Francisco responded that 8 months had been sufficient time for good faith effort, and that partial payment demonstrated imperial willingness to honor the negotiated terms. The division of ransom treasure among Spanish participants occupied several weeks and nearly precipitated civil war within Francisco's forces. The King's Royal Fifth claimed 20% of the total for the Spanish crown, while Francisco's personal share as expedition commander amounted to another 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver, wealth that made him one of the richest men in Europe. But even common soldiers received shares worth more than they could have earned in decades of ordinary labor, creating a group of suddenly wealthy men whose primary loyalty was to the commander who had made their enrichment possible. The treasure division also revealed the true scale of wealth that Spanish intervention had unlocked throughout the empire. The ransom payment, despite representing only a fraction of imperial resources, exceeded the total precious metal reserves of European kingdoms. Spanish soldiers who had lived in poverty throughout their lives found themselves possessing more gold than minor nobles, while Francisco himself commanded resources that rivaled those of European monarchs. The psychological impact was transformative. These men now had fortunes to protect and positions to maintain, making retreat or failure unthinkable regardless of the risks involved. But wealth created new vulnerabilities alongside new opportunities. The Spanish now carried treasure that made them targets for every hostile force in Peru, while their obvious enrichment demonstrated to native populations exactly what conquest would cost. More dangerously, the success of the ransom collection proved that imperial resources were indeed as vast as Spanish hopes had imagined, making Peru the most valuable prize in the New World and attracting additional European attention that would complicate Francisco's efforts to consolidate his position. The completion of ransom payment created the moment Francisco had been dreading since capturing Atahualpa 8 months earlier. The decision about whether to honor his agreement to release the emperor or find justification for continued captivity. Releasing Atahualpa would restore imperial unity while demonstrating Spanish good faith, but it would also eliminate the constitutional paralysis that had prevented effective resistance to Spanish occupation. Keeping him prisoner would maintain Spanish advantages while violating the terms of their negotiated agreement, potentially provoking desperate resistance from imperial forces that had thus far shown remarkable restraint. Francisco's senior officers were unanimously opposed to releasing Atahualpa, arguing that Spanish forces remained too small to survive renewed imperial unity under competent leadership. They pointed to intelligence reports suggesting that Inca armies around Quito and Cusco were already preparing for coordinated attacks that would eliminate Spanish presence throughout the highlands. The emperor's freedom would provide the catalyst for transforming these separate threats into unified resistance that could overwhelm Spanish positions regardless of their technological advantages. But Francisco understood that executing Atahualpa would create different but equally serious problems for Spanish colonial efforts. The emperor was revered as a divine figure whose murder would transform him into a martyr around whom imperial resistance could unite. Moreover, executing a legitimate monarch after accepting ransom for his release would establish Spanish reputation for treachery that would make future negotiations with native leaders virtually impossible. The decision required balancing immediate tactical necessities against long-term strategic considerations in ways that offered no clearly superior options. The solution Francisco ultimately chose reflected his characteristic combination of pragmatic ruthlessness and careful political calculation. Rather than simply executing Atahualpa or releasing him, he would conduct a formal trial that would provide legal justification for the emperor's death, while demonstrating Spanish commitment to orderly judicial procedures. The charges would focus on Atahualpa's alleged crimes against Spanish authority and Christian religion, areas where European legal concepts could be applied regardless of their relevance to Andean political traditions. The trial of Atahualpa began on July 15, 1533, in the same plaza where Spanish forces had captured the emperor 8 months earlier. Francisco assembled a tribunal consisting of Spanish officers and colonial officials, while Father Valverde provided religious authority for proceedings that would determine whether the most powerful ruler in the Americas would live or die. The charges included rebellion against Spanish authority, ordering the murder of his brother Huáscar, practicing idolatry, and maintaining multiple wives in violation of Christian marriage customs. The proceedings were conducted with elaborate attention to European legal forms, complete with formal accusations, witness testimony, and defense arguments. Atahualpa was assigned a Spanish advocate who argued that the emperor had acted within his legitimate authority and that Spanish courts lacked jurisdiction over imperial internal affairs, but the outcome had been predetermined by military necessity. Francisco needed Atahualpa dead to maintain Spanish control, and the trial served primarily to provide legal justification for that predetermined conclusion. Atahualpa's responses to the charges revealed the dignity and intelligence that had made him master of the Andes. He denied ordering Huáscar's death, pointing out that Civil War casualties were common in dynastic conflicts and that Spanish courts had no standing to judge imperial succession disputes. He defended Inca religious practices as legitimate expressions of ancestral traditions, arguing that forcible conversion violated natural law principles that Europeans claimed to respect. Most pointedly, he questioned Spanish authority to conduct trials for actions taken by a sovereign ruler within his own territory. But legal arguments could not overcome military realities. The tribunal found Atahualpa guilty on all charges and sentenced him to death by burning, the standard European punishment for heresy and idolatry. Francisco commuted the sentence to strangulation after the emperor agreed to Christian baptism, a mercy that demonstrated Spanish religious charity while ensuring that the execution would proceed as planned. The date was set for July 26, 1533, providing enough time for proper ceremonial preparation but not enough for rescue attempts by imperial forces. The execution of Atahualpa was conducted with solemnity befitting the death of an emperor, even one condemned by foreign courts for crimes against alien law. The Spanish assembled their forces in full array around the plaza, creating a display of military power that was intended to discourage resistance while demonstrating European commitment to orderly government. Native observers were permitted to witness the proceedings, though under careful guard that would prevent any attempts to rescue their condemned leader. Atahualpa faced death with the composure expected of divine royalty, accepting Christian baptism while maintaining his dignity throughout the final ceremonies. His last words, spoken through Felipillo's translation, expressed concern for his children's welfare and hoped that Spanish promises of just government would prove more reliable than their commitment to honoring ransom agreements. The emperor was strangled at sunset on July 26, 1533, ending a reign that had lasted less than 6 years but had encompassed the largest empire in New World history. The immediate aftermath of Atahualpa's execution revealed both the wisdom and the dangers of Francisco's decision. Imperial armies that had remained largely passive during the emperor's captivity began mobilizing for coordinated resistance, as provincial commanders recognized that negotiation with Spanish forces was no longer possible. But the execution also eliminated the constitutional paralysis that had prevented effective imperial administration, allowing Francisco to install a puppet emperor in the person of Manco Cápac, Atahualpa's half-brother, who could provide legitimacy for Spanish rule, while lacking the personal authority to challenge European control. The death of the last independent Inca emperor marked the end of one phase of Spanish conquest and the beginning of another. Francisco had achieved what many had considered impossible: the capture and control of an empire larger than any European kingdom, using forces smaller than those required to garrison a single Spanish city. But execution of Atahualpa transformed the conquest from a political maneuver into a permanent military occupation that would require decades to consolidate and generations to complete. Francisco Pizarro stood once again in the plaza of Cajamarca, surrounded by evidence of his impossible success but acutely aware that the most dangerous challenges still lay ahead. The execution of Atahualpa had eliminated the immediate threat of imperial reunification, but it had also committed Spanish forces to permanent occupation of territory they could never hope to control through military force alone. The true conquest of Peru was just beginning. The plaza where Atahualpa died would never again witness such concentrated power in the hands of so few men, but Francisco understood that executing the emperor had transformed him from conqueror into colonial administrator, a role that required different skills and carried different dangers. Within hours of the strangling, Francisco's scouts reported smoke signals rising from mountainsides throughout the region, carrying news of the emperor's death to every corner of what had once been a unified empire. The constitutional crisis that had paralyzed imperial resistance was ending, replaced by something potentially more dangerous: the fury of a people who had witnessed their god-king murdered by foreign invaders. The installation of Manco Cápac as puppet emperor proceeded with elaborate ceremony designed to demonstrate continuity of legitimate authority while establishing Spanish control over imperial institutions. Francisco understood that European domination required native collaboration, and Manco represented the ideal collaborator, young enough to be malleable, legitimate enough to command respect, and desperate enough to accept Spanish protection against rivals who might challenge his claim to the throne. The coronation ceremony blended Inca traditions with Spanish innovations, creating a hybrid ritual that satisfied both European legal requirements and Andean concepts of divine kingship. But Francisco's greatest challenge was no longer political, it was logistical. The Spanish now controlled, at least nominally, an empire that stretched nearly 3,000 miles from north to south and encompassed perhaps 10 million subjects. Managing such territory required administrative capabilities that Francisco's small force simply did not possess. Even with reinforcements from Panama and other Spanish colonies, European personnel in Peru numbered fewer than 2,000 men, most of them soldiers rather than administrators. The mathematics of colonial control were daunting. One Spaniard for every 5,000 native subjects, scattered across terrain that made communication and coordination almost impossible. Francisco's solution revealed the pragmatic intelligence that had carried him from Extremadura pig farms to the throne room of the Inca Empire. Rather than attempting direct Spanish administration of conquered territory, he would govern through existing imperial structures, replacing Inca officials with Spanish supervisors while maintaining the bureaucratic systems that had made the empire function efficiently for centuries. The encomienda system, already tested in Caribbean colonies, would be adapted to Andean conditions. Spanish colonists would receive grants of native labor and tribute in exchange for providing protection and Christian instruction to indigenous communities. The march to Cusco began in August 1533, with Francisco leading a combined force of Spanish soldiers and native auxiliaries toward the imperial capital that had ruled the Andes for nearly 4 centuries. The journey would take them through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, mountain passes that reached heights of 15,000 feet, valleys so deep that sunlight barely penetrated their depths, and rivers that required crossing on bridges suspended over gorges that seemed to drop into the center of the Earth. But Francisco had learned that the Inca road system, originally built to facilitate imperial control, could serve Spanish purposes equally well. The Spanish column that wound its way through the Andes during those autumn months of 1533 was unlike any military force that had ever traversed the imperial highways. European cavalry rode alongside native porters carrying supplies that included both steel weapons and golden treasures looted from conquered cities. Spanish officers studied maps drawn by indigenous guides while planning campaigns against resistance forces that might materialize at any mountain pass or river crossing. The expedition represented a fusion of European military technology with Andean geographical knowledge, creating capabilities that neither culture could have achieved independently. But the march to Cusco was contested every mile of the way. Inca General Quizquiz, one of Atahualpa's most capable military commanders, had assembled an army of perhaps 30,000 warriors in the mountains between Cajamarca and the imperial capital. Unlike the ceremonial forces that had accompanied Atahualpa to his fatal meeting with Spanish diplomacy, these were professional soldiers equipped for serious warfare against European technology. They had learned from observing Spanish tactics during the previous year, adapting their formations and weapons to counter the advantages that had made conquest possible at Cajamarca. The Battle of Vilcabamba demonstrated that Spanish military superiority was not absolute when faced with intelligent native adaptation. Quizquiz's forces attacked the Spanish column at a carefully chosen position where the imperial road passed through a narrow defile between towering cliffs. The Inca general had positioned archers on the heights above the pass while blocking the road itself, with formations of spearmen whose bronze-pointed weapons could not penetrate Spanish armor but could certainly kill Spanish horses. The ambush was perfectly executed, trapping Francisco's forces in a killing zone where their mobility advantages were neutralized by terrain. Francisco's response to this crisis revealed the tactical flexibility that separated successful conquistadors from mere adventurers. Rather than attempting to fight through the ambush using conventional European methods, he divided his forces into 3 columns that attacked simultaneously from different directions. Spanish cavalry charged directly into the Inca formations blocking the road, while infantry scaled the cliff faces to engage the archers positioned above. Most innovatively, Francisco sent a 3rd force around the mountain to attack Quizquiz's camp from behind, threatening the Inca general's supplies and communications. The battle raged for an entire day, with Spanish steel gradually overcoming native bronze through superior metallurgy and tactical coordination. But victory came at a cost that demonstrated the dangers of prolonged resistance. Francisco lost 8 men killed and dozens wounded, casualties that represented a significant portion of his limited forces. More ominously, the Spanish discovered that Inca weapons, while inferior to European steel, could still kill Europeans who made tactical mistakes or found themselves isolated from supporting formations. The myth of Spanish invincibility was beginning to show cracks that native observers would remember and exploit. Quizquiz's army melted away into the mountains after its defeat at Vilcabamba, but the general himself escaped with the core of his forces intact. Francisco understood that this represented a strategic failure despite his tactical victory. Allowing capable enemy commanders to survive meant that resistance would continue to materialize at unexpected times and places. The Spanish were learning that conquest was easier than pacification, and that military victory did not automatically translate into political control over populations determined to resist foreign domination. The approach to Cusco revealed the true scale of what Spanish conquest had accomplished. The imperial capital sprawled across a high valley surrounded by peaks that scraped the sky, its stone buildings arranged in patterns that demonstrated mathematical sophistication rivaling anything in Europe. The city's population had swelled to perhaps 200,000 residents, as refugees from throughout the empire sought shelter behind walls that had never been breached by hostile forces. Spanish scouts reported that Cusco's defenders had prepared for siege warfare, stockpiling food and weapons while fortifying positions that commanded the approaches to the city center. But Francisco discovered that political warfare could be more effective than military assault when dealing with urban populations whose loyalty remained uncertain. Rather than attacking Cusco directly, he established his forces outside the city while opening negotiations with faction leaders who might be willing to collaborate with Spanish authority. The puppet emperor Manco Capac proved invaluable for these discussions, as his presence demonstrated that cooperation with Spanish forces did not require abandoning traditional loyalties or cultural identities. The entry into Cusco on November 15, 1533, exactly 1 year after the trap at Cajamarca, was stage-managed as a restoration of legitimate imperial authority rather than a foreign conquest. Manco Capac rode at the head of the procession, surrounded by the symbols and ceremonies of traditional kingship, while Francisco followed discreetly behind with forces that remained visible but not threatening. The message was carefully calculated. Spanish power would support legitimate Inca authority while protecting the city's inhabitants from the chaos that might otherwise follow imperial collapse. The reality behind this ceremonial facade was more complex and considerably more brutal. Spanish forces immediately began systematic looting of Cusco's temples, palaces, and public buildings, stripping away centuries of accumulated wealth in a process that made the Cajamarca ransom seem modest by comparison. The Temple of the Sun alone yielded enough gold to finance a European war, while imperial palaces contained silver ornaments that filled Spanish warehouses despite the precious metal's relative abundance throughout the Andes. Francisco estimated that Cusco's total wealth exceeded the gross domestic product of Spain itself. More significantly, the Spanish began the systematic dismantling of imperial administrative structures that had governed the Andes for 4 centuries. The Quipu keepers, who had maintained records of population, tribute, and resource distribution, were replaced by Spanish clerks whose alphabetic literacy seemed primitive compared to the sophisticated information systems they were destroying. Traditional authorities who had administered imperial provinces found themselves superseded by Spanish encomenderos, whose understanding of local conditions was limited, but whose authority was backed by steel weapons and mounted soldiers. The psychological impact of these changes on Cusco's native population was profound and immediate. The city had been the center of a world that extended from modern Ecuador to central Chile, a place where tribute flowed from dozens of conquered peoples while administrative decisions affected millions of subjects. Witnessing that world's systematic destruction by fewer than 200 foreign soldiers created trauma that would echo through generations. Spanish observers noted that many indigenous residents seemed to move through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, performing familiar tasks in a reality that no longer made sense according to traditional understanding. But Francisco's most serious challenge was managing the Spanish colonists whose success had created new problems alongside new opportunities. The wealth flowing from Peruvian conquest attracted additional adventurers from throughout the Spanish Caribbean, men who arrived expecting immediate rewards for their participation in what they viewed as an ongoing enterprise. By early 1534, Spanish forces in Peru numbered nearly 4,000, but Francisco lacked sufficient territory and native labor to satisfy everyone's expectations for enrichment. The solution was territorial expansion that would continue Spanish conquest while providing new opportunities for colonial advancement. Francisco organized expeditions to explore and conquer regions that had remained outside direct imperial control, areas where additional Spanish colonies could be established without competing directly with existing settlements. His brother Gonzalo led forces into the Amazon basin searching for the golden kingdom of El Dorado that native informants described in terms that seemed too fantastic to believe but too detailed to dismiss entirely. Meanwhile, Francisco began the construction of Lima, a Spanish city that would serve as the administrative center for colonial Peru while providing a secure base for European population growth. The location was chosen for its strategic advantages: close enough to the coast to maintain communication with Spain, but far enough inland to be defensible against potential naval attacks. More importantly, Lima would be built according to European urban planning principles, creating a space where Spanish colonists could maintain their cultural identity while adapting to Andean environmental conditions. The founding of Lima represented Francisco's vision for long-term colonial success in Peru. Rather than simply extracting wealth for shipment to Spain, the new city would develop local industries and agricultural systems that could support permanent Spanish settlement. European craftsmen would establish workshops that produced goods adapted to local conditions, while Spanish farmers would introduce Old World crops and livestock to New World environments. The goal was creating a self-sustaining colonial society that could survive and prosper regardless of political developments in distant Spain. But Francisco's grand plans for colonial development were threatened by the same success that had made them possible. The wealth flowing from Peru attracted not just additional settlers, but rival conquistadors who claimed superior authority to govern conquered territory. Diego de Almagro, Francisco's former partner, had received royal authorization to govern southern portions of the empire, creating competing claims to jurisdiction that could only be resolved through negotiation or warfare. More ominously, the Spanish crown was beginning to assert direct control over colonial administration, sending royal officials who viewed Francisco's independent authority as an obstacle to efficient imperial governance. The conflict with Almagro escalated throughout 1535 as both men maneuvered for political advantage while maintaining the pretense of loyal cooperation in service to Spanish imperial interest. The dispute centered on control of Cusco, which both claimed fell within their respective jurisdictions according to conflicting interpretations of royal grants. Francisco argued that his conquest of the imperial capital gave him legitimate authority over the city regardless of geographical boundaries established by distant bureaucrats. Almagro countered that his royal commission specifically included the territory surrounding Cusco, making Francisco's occupation technically illegal under Spanish colonial law. The resolution came through warfare that demonstrated how quickly Spanish colonial success could generate internal conflicts capable of destroying everything the conquistadors had achieved. The Battle of Salinas in April 1538 pitted Francisco's forces against Almagro's in combat that was more vicious than anything either side had experienced fighting indigenous resistance. Spanish steel turned against Spanish steel in a conflict that cost both factions casualties they could ill afford while providing opportunities for native resistance forces that had been waiting for exactly such European divisions. Francisco's victory at Salinas eliminated his most serious rival, while establishing his unchallenged authority over the wealthiest portions of conquered Peru. But the battle's aftermath revealed the moral costs of success that had required systematic betrayal of former allies and friends. Almagro was captured and executed, dying with dignity that contrasted sharply with the treachery that had brought him to Spanish justice. Francisco watched his former partner's death and understood that he had crossed lines that would forever separate him from the desperate but honorable adventurer who had first sailed from Panama in search of golden kingdoms. The execution of Almagro also created new enemies among Spanish colonists who had supported the losing faction. Almagro's son, Diego the Younger, began organizing resistance to Francisco's authority while cultivating relationships with royal officials who viewed the independent-minded conquistador as an obstacle to efficient colonial administration. The Spanish community in Peru was fracturing along lines of personal loyalty and political ambition, creating instability that threatened everything Francisco had accomplished during nearly a decade of conquest and consolidation. Meanwhile, native resistance to Spanish rule was evolving from desperate rebellions into coordinated campaigns led by indigenous leaders who had learned to exploit European weaknesses. Manco Capac, the puppet emperor whom Francisco had installed to legitimize Spanish authority, escaped from Cusco in 1536 and established an independent kingdom in the mountains east of the imperial capital. From this base, Manco organized systematic attacks on Spanish positions throughout the highlands, demonstrating that native military capabilities had adapted significantly since the early days of conquest. The Great Rebellion of 1536 to 1537 nearly succeeded in driving Spanish forces from Peru entirely. Manco's coordinated attacks targeted Spanish communications, isolated colonial settlements, and the supply lines that connected coastal bases with highland positions. The siege of Cusco lasted for nearly a year, with Spanish defenders reduced to eating their horses while indigenous forces demonstrated tactical sophistication that European observers had not previously witnessed among native armies. Francisco himself was trapped in Lima during the worst phase of the rebellion, watching smoke signals carry news of Spanish defeats throughout territories he had believed securely conquered. The Spanish ultimately survived the Great Rebellion through a combination of superior weapons technology, loyal native auxiliaries, and Francisco's ability to maintain discipline among colonial forces even during periods of extreme hardship. But victory came at enormous cost. Hundreds of Spanish colonists died during the fighting, while entire regions that had been pacified reverted to indigenous control. More significantly, the rebellion demonstrated that Spanish authority in Peru remained dependent on constant military vigilance rather than genuine political acceptance by native populations. Francisco's response to the Great Rebellion revealed both his strategic intelligence and his increasing ruthlessness in dealing with challenges to Spanish authority. Rather than simply suppressing indigenous resistance through military force, he began systematic campaigns designed to eliminate native leadership capabilities permanently. Traditional authorities who had cooperated with Spanish rule but might potentially organize future resistance were removed from their positions and replaced with collaborators whose loyalty was ensured through rewards and punishments. The message was clear. Cooperation with Spanish authority would be rewarded, but any hint of potential disloyalty would be met with crushing retaliation. The consolidation of Spanish control after 1537 established patterns of colonial governance that would persist for centuries. The encomienda system was refined and expanded, creating a hierarchy of Spanish colonists who received grants of native labor and tribute in exchange for military service and Christian instruction. Indigenous communities found themselves incorporated into colonial economic systems that extracted wealth for shipment to Europe, while providing minimal compensation for the populations that actually produced that wealth. The transformation was systematic and irreversible. Peru was becoming a Spanish colony rather than an independent kingdom under European protection. But Francisco's greatest triumph was also the source of his greatest vulnerability. The wealth that flowed from Peru to Spain attracted royal attention that would ultimately prove fatal to the independent authority he had carved from Andean mountains and native blood. Charles V and his advisors understood that colonial territories generating such enormous revenues required direct royal administration rather than management by conquistadors whose primary loyalty was to their own enrichment. The Spanish crown began appointing viceroys and royal officials who would gradually replace the autonomous authority that Francisco had exercised since capturing Atahualpa nearly a decade earlier. The arrival of Viceroy Blasco Núñez Vela in 1544 marked the beginning of Francisco's final crisis. The viceroy carried royal instructions to implement the new laws that would eliminate the encomienda system and establish direct crown control over indigenous populations. For Francisco and his fellow conquistadors, these reforms threatened everything they had risked their lives to achieve: the wealth, the status, and the authority that had justified decades of hardship and violence. The choice was stark: submit to royal authority and accept the loss of everything conquest had provided, or resist the crown and risk being branded traitors to the very king they had served so faithfully. Francisco chose resistance, but his defiance lacked the desperate energy that had carried him through the conquest of the Inca Empire. He was 66 years old, wealthy beyond imagination, but increasingly isolated from both Spanish colonists and native populations. Many of his original followers had died in battles or returned to Spain with their fortunes. The new generation of Spanish settlers had different priorities and loyalties, viewing Francisco as a relic of the conquest era rather than a leader whose authority they felt compelled to acknowledge. Even his own family had begun to fracture, as his brothers pursued their own interests with limited regard for collective Pizarro ambitions. The resistance to royal authority proved brief and futile. Francisco's forces defeated Viceroy Núñez Vela in battle, but victory against royal representatives marked him as a rebel whose continued existence threatened Spanish colonial stability throughout the Americas. The crown responded by dispatching Pedro de la Gasca, a priest and skilled negotiator who understood that Francisco could be defeated more easily through political maneuvering than military confrontation. Gasca offered pardons and rewards to Spanish colonists who abandoned Francisco's cause, systematically isolating the conquistador from potential supporters while building his own coalition of colonial officials and military leaders. By 1548, Francisco found himself commanding a shrinking force of personal retainers and desperate adventurers who had nowhere else to turn. The great conquistador, who had once dictated terms to emperors, was reduced to guerrilla warfare in the same mountains where he had first encountered the Inca Empire 15 years earlier. His brother Gonzalo was captured and executed as a traitor, while other family members fled Peru or submitted to royal authority in exchange for pardons and reduced privileges. The Pizarro brothers, who had once seemed destined to found a colonial dynasty, were scattered by the same Spanish crown they had enriched through their conquests. The end came not through battlefield defeat, but through betrayal that echoed the methods Francisco had used to achieve his own rise to power. On June 26, 1541, a group of Spanish colonists loyal to Diego de Almagro the Younger forced their way into Francisco's palace in Lima, overwhelming his guards through surprise rather than superior numbers. The men who killed Francisco Pizarro were not indigenous warriors seeking revenge for their conquered empire, but fellow Spaniards whose grievances stemmed from the internal conflicts that had plagued colonial Peru since the conquest's earliest days. Francisco died as he had lived, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, refusing to surrender even when resistance had become futile. According to witnesses, his final words were an attempt to draw a cross in his own blood while invoking the name of Jesus Christ, a gesture that captured both the religious conviction and the violent pragmatism that had characterized his entire career. The man who had conquered the largest empire in the New World died on the floor of his own palace, surrounded by the wealth his audacity had extracted from Andean mountains and the enemies his success had created among his own countrymen. The legacy of Francisco Pizarro's conquest would outlive him by centuries, shaping the development of South American civilization in ways that continue to resonate today. The Spanish colonial system he established in Peru became the template for European domination throughout the Andes, creating social hierarchies and economic structures that concentrated wealth in European hands while relegating indigenous populations to subservient roles in their own homeland. The cultural fusion that emerged from conquest, Spanish, Inca, and African elements combining to create new forms of art, architecture, cuisine, and religious expression, represented one of history's most complex examples of civilizational interaction under conditions of extreme inequality. But perhaps Francisco's most important legacy was demonstrating that individual audacity could reshape the world when combined with favorable circumstances and superior technology. His conquest of Peru proved that small numbers of determined Europeans could overthrow civilizations that had endured for centuries, establishing patterns of colonial domination that would eventually extend European influence to every inhabited continent. The methods he pioneered, exploiting internal divisions, using superior weapons technology, and governing through compliant native authorities, became standard practices for colonial expansion throughout the early modern period. The economic consequences of Francisco's conquest echoed far beyond Peru's borders. The silver extracted from Andean mines flooded European markets, financing Spanish imperial expansion while creating the first truly global economy based on American precious metals. The wealth that flowed from Peru to Spain and from Spain throughout Europe and Asia fundamentally altered the balance of world power while establishing economic relationships that would persist into the modern era. Francisco had not simply conquered an empire, he had unlocked resources that would reshape global civilization for centuries. Yet the human costs of that achievement remained staggering by any measure. The indigenous population of Peru, estimated at perhaps 10 million when Francisco first landed on its coasts, had fallen to fewer than 2 million by the time Spanish colonial administration was fully established. Disease, warfare, forced labor, and cultural destruction combined to eliminate entire peoples whose ancestors had built Machu Picchu, developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, and created administrative systems that efficiently governed territory spanning thousands of miles. The magnificent civilization that Francisco encountered in 1532 survived only in fragmentary ruins and the traumatic memories of its survivors' descendants. Francisco Pizarro died as one of the wealthiest men who had ever lived, master of territories larger than European kingdoms, commander of resources that rivaled those of crowned monarchs. But he also died as a traitor to his own king, abandoned by former allies and surrounded by enemies whose hatred stemmed directly from the methods he had used to achieve his extraordinary success. His life embodied both the possibilities and the contradictions of the age of exploration, a time when individual courage and ruthless ambition could accomplish impossible things, but only through violence that destroyed as much as it created. Standing today in the plaza of Cajamarca where Francisco sprang his trap on Atahualpa nearly 5 centuries ago, visitors find a quiet square surrounded by colonial buildings whose Spanish architecture incorporates Inca stonework that no European mason could duplicate. The Golden Room where the last emperor offered his ransom is long gone. Its precious walls melted down and shipped to Spain to finance wars and palaces whose own ruins now attract tourists seeking traces of vanished grandeur. But the plaza itself remains, bearing witness to the afternoon when fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers changed the course of human history through an audacity so complete it still takes the breath away. Francisco Pizarro achieved something that no rational person would have attempted: the conquest of a sophisticated empire by a force so small it would have been inadequate to garrison a single European city. His success required not just courage, but intelligence, political skill, and ruthless determination to exploit every advantage while accepting risks that would have paralyzed more cautious men. In transforming himself from an illiterate swineherd into the conqueror of Peru, he demonstrated that the Renaissance ideal of individual achievement through force of will was not merely literary fantasy, but historical reality. Yet Francisco's story also reminds us that the most extraordinary individual achievements often come at extraordinary human costs, and that the line between hero and monster sometimes depends more on perspective than on objective moral judgment. The Spanish soldiers who followed him into the Andes saw a leader whose courage and intelligence had made them wealthy beyond their dreams. The indigenous peoples whose world he destroyed saw a destroyer whose violence had shattered civilizations that had endured for centuries. Both perspectives contain truth that cannot be easily reconciled or dismissed. Perhaps that is Francisco Pizarro's most important legacy, forcing us to confront the complexity of human ambition and the consequences of extraordinary achievement in a world where individual triumph and collective tragedy often spring from the same historical moment. His conquest of Peru remains one of the most remarkable military achievements in human history, accomplished through methods that would be considered unconscionable by modern standards, but which reflected the brutal realities of 16th century colonial expansion. The plaza of Cajamarca is quiet now, its stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps from pilgrims and tourists who come to stand where history pivoted on the edge of a Spanish sword. The empire Francisco destroyed has long since vanished, replaced by nations whose borders reflect colonial administrative convenience rather than indigenous cultural boundaries. The wealth he extracted from Andean mines has been spent and respent countless times, transformed into different forms of power and influence across 5 centuries of global development. But the memory of what happened here endures, preserved in chronicles written by Spanish participants and oral traditions maintained by indigenous communities whose ancestors witnessed the collision between worlds. Francisco Pizarro's name remains known throughout the Americas, carried by cities and streets and monuments that commemorate both his achievements and his crimes. He achieved the immortality he sought when he first sailed from Panama in search of golden kingdoms, though perhaps not in the form he would have preferred. In the end, Francisco Pizarro's conquest of Peru stands as testament to the power of individual will when backed by superior technology and favorable circumstances. His success required extraordinary courage, but it also required the advantages that European civilization provided: steel weapons, horses, diseases to which indigenous populations had no immunity, and most importantly, writing systems that allowed coordination of complex operations across vast distances and extended time periods. Without these advantages, Francisco's audacity would have led only to his death in some forgotten Andean valley. But with them, an illiterate bastard from a Spanish pig farm conquered the largest empire in the New World and opened South America to European colonization that would reshape global civilization. The achievement remains as remarkable today as it seemed to contemporaries who witnessed Spanish ships returning from Peru laden with treasure that exceeded the combined wealth of European kingdoms. Francisco Pizarro proved that the age of exploration was also an age when individual ambition could literally change the world. The conquistador who died in his Lima palace surrounded by enemies of his own creation had traveled further from his origins than any reasonable person would have thought possible. The boy who tended pigs in the hills outside Trujillo became the man who destroyed the Inca Empire and established Spanish domination over territory that stretched from the Caribbean to the Pacific Ocean. His story reminds us that history's most transformative moments often emerge from the collision between extraordinary individuals and extraordinary circumstances, producing consequences that echo across centuries while raising questions that each generation must answer anew. That is the true legacy of Francisco Pizarro. Not just the conquest of Peru, but the demonstration that human ambition, when combined with technological advantage and historical opportunity, can accomplish things that seem impossible until they actually happen. His success came at enormous cost, but it remains one of the most remarkable individual achievements in the long story of human civilization. Whether we judge him as hero or monster, we cannot deny that Francisco Pizarro changed the world in ways that continue to shape our own.